I died for 92 seconds on a Friday morning. By Saturday afternoon, my wife was standing outside my hospital room asking a neurologist how quickly a man with short-term memory problems could be declared unfit to run his own company. She thought I was asleep when she asked it. My younger brother was standing beside her with a legal pad in his hand. That was the moment I understood something simple and ugly. The scariest part of almost dying is not the tunnel, or the pain, or the humiliating plastic tubes, or the sound your own body makes when it stops cooperating. The scariest part is waking up while the people closest to you are already rearranging your life as if you are still halfway gone. My name is Adrian Mercer. I am 47 years old. Until that Friday, I believed three things with the confidence of a man who had never really had them tested. I believed my wife loved me. I believed my younger brother admired me. And I believed Mercer Build Group was not just my company, but the clearest proof that I had built something strong enough to outlast my own bad luck. I was wrong on all three. If you stay with me, I will tell you how my wife and my brother tried to turn one cardiac arrest into a legal excuse to steal my company, my house, and my daughter. I will tell you how my daughter became the first person to warn me that they were writing lines for her to repeat. I will tell you what they thought they could sign on a Monday morning. And I will tell you why. By the end of it, the only thing I really wanted back was not the company, not the house, not even the money. It was the right to decide who got to keep speaking in my name. Before all of that, my life looked expensive, orderly, and impressively boring. Mercer Build Group was not glamorous. We were not one of those companies with a lobby full of glass and slogans. We were a mid-sized construction and site logistics firm based outside Baltimore. Commercial retrofits, municipal contracts, warehouse conversions, ugly jobs done cleanly and on time by people who knew how to read a set of drawings and keep their mouths shut when clients panicked. My father had been a framer. My grandfather poured concrete. I was the first Mercer to wear tailored suits, often enough that dry cleaners started greeting me like family. I built the business the slow way. No miracle investor, no flashy expansion fueled by other people's money, just years of showing up early, bidding carefully, eating losses when I had to, and remembering that most men ruin themselves by trying to look bigger than they are. My wife Celeste used to say that was what she respected most about me, that I never performed success. I just built it. Celeste had a way of speaking that made ordinary compliments sound like private discoveries. That was one of the first things that drew me to her. The second was her steadiness, at least what I mistook for steadiness. She was elegant without looking like she had worked for it. Dark hair, precise posture, a voice that never rose unless she wanted somebody else to seem unreasonable by comparison. My brother Gavin was 4 years younger than me and had spent most of his life orbiting whatever room I happened to be standing in. That sounds cruel. I do not mean it cruelly. It is simply true. When we were boys, he copied my walk. When we were teenagers, he borrowed my jackets without asking. When we were older, he came to work for the company for a season and never really left. He was good at things I was not. Charm, dinner conversations, making nervous investors feel like they were the only people in the room. He wore better shoes than I did and had the kind of smile that made women assume depth where there was mostly appetite. For years, the arrangement worked. I handled operations, risk, contracts, field leadership, the ugly practical spine of the company. Gavin handled certain clients, networking, presentations, damage control when city people needed reassurance in polished language. Celeste occasionally hosted company dinners and charity events and sat beside me at tables where donors and officials mistook marriage for stability and stability for virtue. Our daughter Nora was 15, sharp, watchful, too smart to be managed by cliches, and old enough to understand when adults were lying badly, but still young enough to be wounded by the effort it took them to keep doing it. If you had met us 6 months before I died for 92 seconds, you would have thought we were one of those families other people quietly resent. The kind that seems to have the house, the lake weekends, the good schools, the neat holiday cards, the successful business, the photogenic composure. You would not have seen the rot. I did not see it either. Not fully, only in flashes. Celeste taking calls on the back patio and smiling at her phone with a softness I had stopped receiving. Gavin suddenly inserting himself into decisions he used to leave alone. Nora going quiet whenever the two of them joked too lightly in the kitchen. Invoices that felt slightly fatter than they should have. A new consultant Celeste wanted me to meet because she was thinking ahead about succession and resilience. I laughed at that phrase when she first used it. Resilience. As if marriage were a TED Talk and a company was something you curated for a future slide deck. The morning I collapsed began with rain and a zoning argument. I was in conference room B at the office reviewing revisions for a municipal garage project when my left arm went strange. That is the only word for it. Not pain at first. Strange. Like the arm had become an object temporarily leased to somebody else. Then my chest cinched. Then my vision narrowed. Then one of the project managers asked if I was all right, and I remember thinking I had just enough time to say something witty and absolutely no ability to manage it. The next thing I remember is Dr. Miriam Hale's voice saying, "Stay with us, Mr. Mercer." There are people whose voices sound reliable before your mind has even caught up to their words. Dr. Hale had that kind of voice, low, direct, no extra softness. The voice of a woman who had dragged enough men back from cliffs to stop decorating the process. When I woke properly, it was Sunday, ICU. Machines humming, a room that smelled like recycled air, antiseptic, and the metallic shame of dependence. My throat hurt, my ribs hurt, my mouth tasted like old pennies and cotton. Nurse Leila Perez adjusted my IV and told me, with the flat practicality of somebody who sees resurrection twice a week, that I had been down long enough to frighten everybody worth frightening. "How long?" I asked. 92 seconds without a sustainable rhythm, she said. "Long enough for drama, not long enough for poetry." That almost made me laugh, which hurt, which somehow reassured me. Later, Dr. Hale explained it cleanly. Massive arrhythmia, emergency intervention, temporary hypoxia, good neurological signs so far, no guarantees, no sudden heroics, no stress, no work, no driving, no pretending I was indestructible because men like me usually prefer arrogance to recovery. Then she hesitated. That got my attention faster than the medical part. "Your wife had some questions," she said. "What kind of questions?" She studied me for a second. "Doctors do this when they are deciding whether telling you the truth will help you or simply make the monitors more interesting." She asked about short-term cognitive changes, Dr. Hale said. She asked about decision-making capacity in the weeks after a cardiac event. I told her we do not diagnose incapacity because a spouse is frightened. We evaluate the patient. The room went cold in a way no thermostat causes. And my brother? Present for most of it. I lay there staring at the ceiling and listening to the machine beside me insist I was alive. And in that moment, I felt something inside me slide into place with terrible quiet. Not rage. Not yet. Rage is loud. This was quieter than rage. This was precision. Celeste came in 20 minutes later looking exactly like the ideal version of a worried wife. Cream sweater, minimal makeup, eyes bright with concern. The scent of her expensive perfume arriving half a second before she did. Gavin followed with flowers too large for the room and the face he used when he wanted strangers to think he had been carrying the whole family on his shoulders. "Adrian," Celeste whispered, as if my name might bruise if handled too roughly. She kissed my forehead. Cold lips. Controlled pressure. Not a wife touching a man she almost lost. A woman placing a bookmark where she wanted the scene remembered. Gavin squeezed my shoulder and said, "Scared the hell out of us." He meant it too, just not for the reason a brother should. What followed was almost elegant in its ugliness. Celeste asked how I felt, then whether I remembered the week clearly, then whether I had been confused before the collapse, then whether the contracts on my desk had been signed in the right order, then whether I remembered promising Gavin greater operational authority on the midline account, all in one conversation, all while holding my hand. That is the thing about bad people who think they are sophisticated. They rarely hear their own greed once fear joins it. I answered carefully. Never too much, never too little, enough to let them think I was tired, not enough to let them feel safe. When they left, Nurse Perez walked back in, looked at the flowers, looked at me, and said, "I don't know your family, but your brother smiles like a fundraiser." That accurate? It means I'd count the silver after he left. I liked her immediately. The next real crack came from Nora. She visited me alone the following evening, school blazer still on, hair damp from the rain, eyes rimmed red in a way that suggested not crying now took effort. She sat by the bed, took one look at me, and stopped pretending she was 15 and brave. "I thought you died," she said. "I almost did. That's different. It felt similar." She laughed in spite of herself, then got serious again. That was Nora, quick to humor, quicker back to truth. She held my hand for a long time without speaking. Then she leaned closer and said the sentence that changed the direction of the whole story. "Mom told me if anyone asks, I should say you've been forgetful for months." I looked at her. "What?" She made me practice it. Nora's face flushed with anger now. She said after what happened, people may ask whether you've been under too much pressure, and if they do, I should tell the truth and say you forgot things. She said you forgot my debate finals and left the stove on and asked me twice what day it was. None of that happened. My chest hurt again. Not medically. Something older and crueler than that. "Who was with her?" She hesitated. "Uncle Gavin." There are moments when betrayal arrives not as a shock, but as an administrative update. A clean line inserted into paperwork that was already trending in the wrong direction. That was one of those moments. I did not comfort Nora right away. Not because I did not want to. Because I needed 2 more seconds to stop myself from telling the truth too fast. Instead, I asked, "What exactly did they say?" Nora looked down at her hands and repeated it almost word for word. That is another thing about bright children. They remember language. Adults' hope will blur. They had told her people might ask questions. They had said the company needed protection. They had said stress had been changing me. They had said Gavin might need temporary signing authority if recovery became complicated. They had said families survive hard seasons by staying consistent. Consistent, that word again. Always a soft word doing hard work for cowards. I squeezed Nora's hand and told her two things. First, she had done the right thing by telling me. Second, from that moment on, she was not to repeat anything she did not believe, no matter who asked. Not her mother, not Gavin, not a lawyer, not a doctor, no one. She nodded, then asked the question children only ask when they already know the answer will hurt. Are they lying about you? Yes, I said. She nodded again, not surprised, only disappointed that her own instincts had been confirmed. The next morning I called Ezra Klein. Ezra had been my lawyer for 11 years and my friend for longer than that, though he would insist the overlap weakened both roles. He was a compact man with silver hair, a dry face, and the habit of reading every document as if it had personally insulted him. He came to the hospital with 2 legal pads, 3 pens, and the expression of a man who had canceled better things to attend a fire. I told him everything. Dr. Hale's conversation, Nora's warning, Celeste's questions, Gavin's sudden interest in my authority, the succession consultant I had laughed off, the minor financial oddities I had been too busy to chase. The way Celeste had stopped touching me naturally long before my heart stopped. Ezra listened without interruption. Then he said, "All right, best case, they're panicking opportunists. Worst case, they were already building the paperwork and your cardiac event simply improved the timing. Which do you think it is?" He looked at me over the rim of his glasses. "Adrian, nobody rehearses a child for a panic response." That was enough for me. The first thing Ezra did was boring, which is why it mattered. He froze everything he could without making noise. Voting rights already governed by my existing bylaws, emergency signature protocols, pending board actions, access tiers on internal finance dashboards, the old family trust documents my father had insisted on years earlier, the lake house deed structure, insurance riders, resolutions that most men sign in confidence and never read again until somebody tries to use them against them. The second thing he did was more interesting. He brought in a forensic accountant named Mallory Shaw. Mallory had the face of a patient librarian and the moral temperament of a woman who would happily walk a fraudster into traffic if the law allowed it. She took one look at 6 months of Mercer billed invoices and said, "Your problem isn't sloppiness, your problem is choreography." That sentence still gives me pleasure. Here's what she found within 48 hours. 3 consulting vendors had started billing us within the same quarter. Strategic Continuity Review, Executive Resilience Advisory, Family Governance Alignment. All of them had elegant names. All of them produced documents with the same sentence rhythms. All of them traced back eventually to shell registrations tied to one corporate service address in Delaware. One of the shells led to a secondary holding company. That holding company had recent transfers intersecting with an LLC. Gavin had forgotten to hide properly, and that LLC had placed a deposit on a property outside Annapolis 6 weeks before my collapse. A property Celeste had visited twice according to toll records, and a calendar entry she had carelessly synced to the wrong family account. It was a waterfront house. Not enormous, just expensive enough to signal intent. Too expensive to explain as a random investment. Exactly the kind of place 2 people buy when they plan to step into a cleaner life using somebody else's money as a bridge. When Mallory laid the papers out on my hospital tray table, I did not feel heartbreak first. I felt insulted. Not because my wife had stopped loving me. People fail all the time. Love rots, marriage decays, humans disappoint. That part is almost ordinary. No, what insulted me was the architecture, the consultant shells, the child scripting, the medical capacity questions, the property deposit, the timing. This was not an affair that grew claws. This was a transition plan, and I had been scheduled as the inconvenience. When I finally went home 10 days later, I went back as a different man. Everybody says surviving a medical catastrophe gives you gratitude. Sometimes it does. What it gave me was filtration. Noise dropped away, excuses sounded thinner, people became very quickly the sum of their choices. Celeste met me at the door with soup, softness, and a new level of attentiveness that would have moved me once. Gavin had already reorganized parts of my study to reduce stress. Nora watched everyone like a witness at the wrong trial. The house itself felt staged, pill organizer on the kitchen counter, medical pamphlets too neatly stacked, a notebook labeled recovery beside my chair in the den. 3 different people had made my fragility into interior decor. So I played along. Not because I lacked courage, because I had finally found a better use for it. I let Celeste remind me of medication times. I let Gavin explain what he was temporarily covering at the company. I let them see me pause before answering sometimes. I let Dr. Hale's instruction about low stress become the excuse that kept me out of visible conflict. And at night, when Celeste went to shower and Gavin texted from whatever part of town he preferred for private treachery, I read board minutes, corporate bylaws, vendor packets, email trails, insurance addenda, Draft capacity forms Mallory pulled from a consultant portal that should never have existed. They were building toward Monday. That was the date Ezra circled twice and slid across my desk the first morning I was home. Emergency board session, he said. Called under the pretext of protecting continuity while you recover. That legal? It can be, if everybody stays honest. And here, he almost smiled, no. What they intended was simple. They wanted a temporary governance transfer under a health uncertainty resolution. They wanted Gavin as interim executive authority. They wanted Celeste positioned as domestic stabilizer and medical point of contact. They wanted enough official concern on paper that banks, insurers, and 2 major clients would accept the shift before anyone had time to object cleanly. Once the machine moved, reversing it would become slow, technical, and exhausting, which is exactly how decent men lose to organized parasites. So I built my own machine. First, Ezra drafted a sealed amendment using a clause buried inside our original operating agreement. If I were medically challenged, final voting authority did not pass to family. It passed to an independent recovery trustee selected years earlier. The trustee was not Gavin. It was May Donnelly, my old COO, 62 years old, immune to male charm, and widely feared by everybody who mistakes graciousness for softness. Second, Mallory continued tracing vendor money. By Thursday, she had enough to show that 2 of the consultant shells billed Mercer billed, and then funneled money into the Annapolis property deposit through linked accounts. Third, Nora gave us something none of the adults could have manufactured better. She told Ezra there was a notebook in Celeste's closet full of things Dad has done lately. We found it exactly where she said it would be. Neat entries, dates, supposed memory slips, supposed confusion, supposed emotional volatility, many of them impossible. One of them placed me at home on a day I was on a job site photographed with city inspectors. Another claimed I forgot Nora's school showcase on the same night Celeste had posted 3 pictures of us there. I held that notebook in my hand and understood my wife more clearly than I ever had in our entire marriage. She was not merely dishonest. She was patient. That is always more dangerous. The affair itself came into view almost as a technical detail. A set of messages Mallory recovered from a synced tablet Gavin forgot existed. Nothing melodramatic, no teenage language, no wild declarations. Worse than that, practical messages. Monday needs to look compassionate. Make sure Nora stays consistent. He still trusts Hale more than he should. If he slows down on site access, the midline transfer is easier. The Annapolis place closes clean if we keep the 4th quarter stable. One message from Celeste to Gavin 3 weeks before my collapse said everything. If he burns out on his own, we can do this gently. If not, we may need a medical bridge. A medical bridge. That was what my heart attack became to them. Not a catastrophe, a bridge. I printed that message myself, not because Ezra needed me to, because I wanted the physical act of it. Paper has a way of making evil stop sounding abstract. Friday night, 2 days before the board meeting, Celeste asked if we could have dinner together in the study after Nora went upstairs. She said she missed being close. She said the last 2 weeks had reminded her how fragile life was. She said she wanted us to stop drifting. That last line almost impressed me. Drifting, as if the problem had been weather. I told her yes. Then I asked Gavin to come as well, because I said if Monday was going to involve temporary adjustments, we should speak openly as a family first. He arrived at 7:30, wearing the face he used when he thought he was about to inherit something. Nora was already upstairs by then under May's supervision, because I had stopped trusting the walls of my own house. Ezra and Mallory were not visible. That was part of the design. Some scenes improve when the wrong people think privacy protects them. We sat in the study with drinks untouched between us. Celeste began with concern. Gavin followed with duty. I let them speak. They had prepared this. You could hear it in the sequencing. First, admiration for what I had built. Then concern about recovery. Then gentle reminders that leadership required presence. Then references to stress, confusion, the company's exposure, vendor uncertainty, client nerves. Then Gavin with perfect fake reluctance, saying he would step in only as long as needed, because family had to come before ego. Family. Another soft word dragging a knife. When they finally paused, I asked one question. How long? Celeste's face did something small and hard. Adrian, what do you mean? How long have the 2 of you been planning to use my recovery as a transfer mechanism? Silence. Gavin answered first, which told me everything. Jesus, Adrian. No denial, just tone. People who are innocent usually reach for facts. Guilty people reach for injury. I slid the printed messages across the table, then the shell vendor registrations, then the Annapolis deposit trail, then Celeste's notebook with my invented memory failures. Celeste looked at the pages and turned the color of cold porcelain. Gavin swore softly. For 1 second I saw both of them stripped clean of performance. Not ashamed. Interrupted. That part mattered to me. Celeste recovered first. She always did. You went through my things. It was such a weak sentence in that room that I almost laughed. No, I said. I went through my life. Gavin tried the next angle. You're not thinking clearly. That almost delighted me. The audacity was so pristine it deserved respect, so I gave him none. You mean I'm thinking earlier than you planned? Celeste's voice turned low and dangerous. There are facts you don't understand. I understand enough. I understand the consultant shells. I understand the property. I understand the capacity forms. I understand the scripting for Nora. What I want to know now is whether I was ever supposed to recover in peace. Neither answered. Again, that mattered, because silence is confession wearing expensive clothes. Finally, Celeste said, "You were not managing well before this happened." "Not your answer. You were pushing too hard." "Not my answer." Gavin leaned forward. "Do you know what the company looked like from outside? Do you know how many people were already worried about your judgment?" I smiled then. A real one. Small, exact, and terrible. Enough to elect May Donnelly trustee the second you try to move Monday's resolution. That landed. Gavin actually blinked. Celeste did not move at all for half a second. Then I watched the math happen behind her eyes. May, the clause, the independent authority, the fact that I had not merely discovered their plan. I had already stepped around it. "You can't do that," Gavin said. "I already did." That was the first blow. The second came slower. I told them the Annapolis closing would not happen because the money path had already been traced. I told them the consultant shells had been preserved. I told them any further attempt to present medical incapacity based on fabricated household narratives would move this from betrayal to fraud with a child witness in the center of it. Celeste's control cracked then. Not loudly. That would have been easier. It cracked in contempt. "Do you know how impossible it is to live with a man who only loves the thing he built?" she said. "Do you know what that house feels like from the inside? Contracts at midnight, site calls during dinner, your daughter learning to lower her voice because your stress mattered more than the room. Gavin did not steal anything from you. He stepped into space you left empty." That was the closest thing to truth she gave me all night, which is why it hurt a little, but only a little. Because even true grievances rot when people use them to justify theft. I answered honestly. "If you had wanted out, you could have left. If you had wanted money, we could have divided it. If you had wanted dignity, I would have given it. What you wanted was to keep my name on the building while removing me from the room. That is the part I won't forgive." Gavin stood up then, too quickly. Men do this when charm fails, and they discover too late they built themselves mostly out of charm. "You always thought you were smarter than everybody," he said. "No," I said, "only more patient." That was when Ezra walked in from the side door. He did not speak immediately. He simply placed a recorder on the desk and said, "Good, we've got enough." Celeste closed her eyes. Gavin swore again. And for the first time all evening, I felt something close to satisfaction. Not because they were caught, because they realized how long I had been listening. Monday morning was not the meeting they had planned. May chaired the board session. Ezra handled the legal posture. Mallory presented the vendor flow. Two directors, who had expected a routine continuity vote, sat through 40 minutes of documentation that transformed concern into disgust. By the time Celeste's consultant tried to raise medical uncertainty, Dr. Hale had already submitted her formal statement. I was recovering normally, no basis for incapacity, no basis for emergency override, no basis for family intervention. Then Nora's affidavit was entered under protective seal. Not public, not exploitative, just enough. My daughter's simple account that she had been coached to describe memory problems that never happened ended whatever soft ground Celeste and Gavin thought they still had. Gavin was removed from signing authority before lunch. His access cards were dead by 1:10. May had security escort him out, not because he was violent, but because I wanted the lesson to arrive with public geometry. Celeste was more complicated. Marriage always is. She cried in private once the lawyers started using words like fiduciary exposure, fabricated evidence, and custodial manipulation. The tears were not entirely fake, I do not believe that. But tears that arrive after consequences are not the same thing as remorse. Most people cry hardest for the future they expected to keep. We did not have a screaming divorce. That would have made the story too simple. We had something colder. Precise disclosures, structured separation, property tracing, protective orders around Nora's testimony, the Annapolis deposit unwound, the shell vendors preserved for a civil action that eventually forced a settlement. Gavin will still taste years from now every time he signs his smaller checks. He asked me once during mediation whether I had ever loved him as a brother or only tolerated him as an employee. I answered, "I loved the version of you that had not yet started counting my life as convertible." That shut him up. Celeste asked me a different question near the end. "Who are you now?" I thought about it before answering because it deserved more than bitterness. "I'm the man you thought would wake up grateful enough to be manageable," I said, "and I'm the mistake in that plan." The revenge, if you want to call it that, was never one big explosion. It was not a punch, not a shouting scene, not one triumphant reveal with dramatic music rising behind it. It was better than that. It was control. I let them believe weakness had made me simpler. I let them step far enough into their design that backing out became impossible. I made them speak too clearly. I made the company watch them overreach. I made the paper trail bigger than the marriage. And I made sure the two things they wanted most, my authority and my silence, became the exact tools that buried them. Mercer Build Group survived. Different shape, cleaner, less family, more truth. May stayed another 18 months, and then retired again, this time with a bottle of bourbon and the affectionate threat that if I ever let relatives near governance documents again, she would come back purely to insult me. Nora stayed with me. That part mattered most. She did not emerge from it untouched. No child does. But she stopped speaking like a witness and started laughing like a teenager again, which in my opinion is a higher form of justice than most courts ever manage. I sold the big house the following spring. Too many staged rooms. Too many places where softness had been rehearsed for advantage. I bought something smaller near the water but not on it. A house with wide windows, bad landscaping, and no memory of being used as a set. Sometimes people ask whether the cardiac arrest changed me. Yes, but not in the bright poster way people prefer. I did not come back more forgiving. I came back more exact. I learned that love without scrutiny becomes permission. I learned that family is not a moral credential. I learned that the people who speak most often about continuity are sometimes the ones already packing boxes in secret. And I learned that a man does not lose himself the moment his body fails him. He loses himself when he lets other people narrate that failure for profit. I died for 92 seconds on a Friday morning. They thought that gave them a window. What it actually gave me was clarity. And clarity, in the right hands, is a far more dangerous thing. There was one more scene from that week I have never really managed to forget. Saturday night, the one between the recorded dinner and the Monday board meeting, Nora came downstairs after midnight because she heard voices on the back patio. Not mine. Theirs. Celeste had assumed she was asleep. Gavin had assumed the walls were thicker than they were. They were outside near the herb planters, speaking in the sharp whisper adults use when they want the tone of secrecy without the discipline it requires. Nora stood halfway down the stairs and heard her mother say, "If he starts talking like this in front of the board, push the fatigue angle. He's not consistent enough to sound stable for long." Then Gavin said, "And the girl?" Celeste answered, "She'll do what she's told if she doesn't want this family blown apart." Nora told me that in the kitchen the next morning while she was slicing a peach with far too much force for a 15-year-old making breakfast. Her hands were steady, her voice was not. "She used the word girl," Nora said, "like I was one of the interns." I looked at my daughter and saw, all at once, the exact price adults try to avoid counting when they betray each other through structure instead of chaos. Not only the marriage, not only the company. The child in the middle learning too early that intelligence without decency becomes predation. I asked Nora whether she wanted to submit a statement or whether she wanted to stay entirely out of the legal side. That choice mattered to me. Too many adults had already tried to decide what she would say and when. She thought about it for less than a minute. "If I stay out," she said, "they'll keep pretending they were protecting me." That was my daughter. She had my stubbornness and, unfortunately for the liars around her, her mother's precision. So Ezra took her statement carefully. No pressure, no grand performance, just facts. What she had been told, what she had been asked to repeat, what she heard on the patio, what never actually happened. No embellishment, no invented villainy. People like Celeste and Gavin always imagine they are undone by emotion. Usually, they are undone by sequence. On Sunday, Gavin tried one last private play. He came to my office at home just after noon with coffee and the face of a man auditioning for sincere regret. I let him in because I wanted to see what desperation would make him choose. He stood by the bookshelf too long before sitting down. That is one of the first signs a liar is still building the version he hopes to survive in. "Adrian," he said, "before tomorrow gets bigger than it needs to, I want to say something clean." I almost admired the phrasing. He told me he had crossed lines. He told me Celeste had been unhappy for years. He told me the company needed flexibility. He told me he never wanted to hurt me. He told me Monday could still be framed as a temporary operational measure if I behaved intelligently. There it was. Not apology, terms. He wanted my cooperation in my own removal because it would reduce collateral damage and preserve what he called the family silhouette. I actually laughed at that. A short, ugly laugh that surprised both of us. "The family silhouette," I repeated. "You really do think branding can save anything?" His face hardened. "You don't understand how people see you right now." "No," I said. "You don't understand how carefully I've let you believe that." He set the coffee down untouched. "Celeste was going to leave you anyway. Then she should have left. You would have buried her in the divorce." I looked at him for a long second. "That's the story you needed, isn't it? Not that you wanted my wife. Not that she wanted my money and my name in a cleaner shape. You needed me to be monstrous enough that theft felt like correction." He did not answer. Again, silence. Again, confession by omission. Then he said the worst thing he could have said and still thought himself sympathetic. You were so busy being the center that you never noticed when the room changed. That one landed, because it was not entirely false. I had missed things, signals, loneliness, drift, the emotional weather of my own home. Success makes certain men stupid in very specific ways. We start believing provision is intimacy. We start believing endurance is presence. We start believing a family can read sacrifice fluently even when we never translate it into tenderness. But partial truth is still the favorite tool of thieves. So I answered him the only honest way that mattered. I may have failed my marriage in quiet ways, I said. That does not give you the right to counterfeit my collapse. He left 5 minutes later without the coffee. I poured it out after he was gone. Not because I thought he poisoned it. Because some things become undrinkable on contact. Monday morning, before the board session, I did one last thing for myself. I walked through the empty office while the cleaning crew was still finishing up and stood in the lobby before sunrise. Mercer Build Group's sign was lit through the glass. The reception desk gleamed the way polished desks always do before people ruin them with ordinary life. I stood there longer than I meant to. Not because I was sentimental, because I wanted to understand whether I was fighting for the right thing. A company can become an ego prosthetic if you are not careful. A building with your name on it can convince you it is proof of character instead of simply an asset that benefited from your labor. I needed to know, in that stillness, whether saving Mercer Build was about justice or vanity. The answer came from memory, not pride. I thought about Miguel from Site 3, who put both daughters through college with overtime from our municipal contracts. I thought about Francine in payroll, who had once caught a fraudulent billing pattern before any of the men in project management even knew where to look. I thought about the apprentices who showed up early because we still trained people instead of merely consuming them. I thought about my father, who used to say a business is not honorable because it makes money. It is honorable if people can build a life around it without being used up too quickly. That was when I knew. I was not fighting for a monument. I was fighting to keep two opportunists from converting years of honest work into the stage set for their new life. So I walked upstairs, adjusted my tie, and went into the meeting as calm as a man walking into his own funeral and knowing the corpse on display belongs to somebody else. The room was already full. May sat at the far end of the table with a file stack that looked thick enough to hurt people with. Mallory had a laptop open and 3 tabs ready. Ezra sat beside me. Dr. Hale appeared by video, expression neutral and devastating. Gavin had brought his continuity consultant. Celeste sat near the windows with the composure of a woman who still thought optics might save her. 2 directors looked uncomfortable. 1 looked excited. There is always at least one person in a governance crisis who mistakes proximity for relevance. Gavin started with concern. Of course he did. He spoke about continuity, client confidence, prudent interim structures, and the importance of shielding me from pressure during recovery. He said my health came first. He said the company needed calm. He said families in leadership roles owe the board honesty. Then he slid the proposed temporary authority packet across the table. May did not touch it. She simply asked, "Before we discuss this, would anyone like to disclose why 3 vendors tied to the recommending parties were billing the company for advisory services while funding a personal property acquisition connected to those same parties?" That was the moment the air changed. Not loudly, just pressure. The consultant looked at Gavin. Gavin looked at Celeste. Celeste did what polished people always do when the script tears. She reached for dignity as if posture could serve as evidence. Mallory walked them through the money, cleanly. No moral adjectives, no speech-making. Just timestamps, shell formations, transfers, invoice trails, linked addresses, and the Annapolis deposit. Then Ezra introduced the fabricated cognitive incident notebook. Then Dr. Hale explained, with professional restraint sharp enough to count as cruelty, that no licensed physician in possession of real facts would have recommended a capacity intervention on the basis of household anecdotes prepared by an interested spouse. Then Nora's sealed statement was summarized. By the time May finally touched the temporary authority packet, it was no longer a proposal. It was evidence of ambition wrapped in panic. She held the top page by the corner, looked at Gavin, and said, "You should have chosen a better week to try to look indispensable." I have known May a long time. That was one of the kinder things I have ever heard her say to somebody she had stopped respecting. Celeste did try one last play. She said I had been distant for years. She said my stress had destabilized the home. She said Gavin had been carrying far more operational responsibility than anyone knew. She said whatever mistakes were made came from fear and exhaustion, not malice. Again, not all false. That was what made her effective for so long. So I answered the board myself. Not to defend my marriage. That part was dead. Not to perform injury. That bores me. I answered because the room needed one plain sentence around which the rest could settle. This was not a family trying to survive a medical emergency, I said. This was a family trying to use one. That ended the argument better than any speech would have. After the vote, after Gavin's access was suspended, after Celeste's consultant packed his papers with the speed of a man discovering he preferred unpaid invoices to subpoenas, I went back to my office and closed the door. I expected triumph, or grief, or at least the familiar empty shock that follows collision. What I felt instead was fatigue so clean it almost qualified as peace, not because I had won. Victory is a loud word for the quiet aftermath of betrayal. No, what I felt was the relief of no longer living inside somebody else's hidden timetable. Do you know how much energy it takes to unknowingly serve as the subject of other people's planning? To be the man being discussed in hallways, measured in notebooks, converted into soft language, and repositioned in documents he has never seen? I did not know either until it stopped. That afternoon, Nora came into my office without knocking, dropped her backpack on the sofa, and asked, "Is it over?" I looked at her. "No," I said, "but it's honest now." She thought about that, then nodded like the answer was better than a lie, and therefore usable. That evening we ordered Thai food and ate at the kitchen island because neither of us had any appetite for formality. The house was too quiet. Celeste was at her sister's. Gavin was somewhere else, licking his wounds, and probably still telling himself this had been about necessity rather than hunger. Nora pushed noodles around her plate and finally asked the question she had been circling all week. "Did Mom ever love you?" Children ask this like they are asking for a yes or no. Adults know better. "Yes," I said after a long pause, "just not well enough to stay decent once she stopped being happy." That answer seemed to satisfy her more than anything gentler would have. Another lesson adulthood keeps forcing on us. Truth, offered cleanly, is often kinder than reassurance dressed as fog. Months later, when the divorce was almost done, and the last of the consultant shells had either dissolved or turned into exhibits, I found myself standing in the Annapolis driveway beside the property they thought would become their beginning. The house was not beautiful, not really. That surprised me. From the filings and the rush around it, I had built it into something more seductive in my mind. In reality, it was simply aspirational. Fresh paint, good light, expensive dock. A place meant to symbolize escape to people who had no idea how much dirt they were still dragging behind them. Ezra stood beside me with the closing paperwork that would unwind the deposit and return the property to the market. "Do you want a minute?" he asked. "For what?" "To hate it properly." I looked at the place again, then at the water behind it. "No," I said. "I think I'm done hating symbols." That was true. By then I hated smaller things more honestly. The phrase medical bridge, the word girl in my daughter's retelling, the notebook in Celeste's closet, the soft way Gavin said family silhouette as if language could perfume theft. Those were the real artifacts. The house was only scenery. A year later, Nora asked if I regretted not destroying them harder. That is how teenagers phrase moral philosophy when they still want you to sound dangerous. We were driving back from a college visit. Traffic was bad, sunset ugly and orange over the highway. She had spent the afternoon pretending to be unimpressed by campuses that clearly impressed her. I asked what she meant. "You could have ruined them more," she said. "Publicly, you didn't." I thought about it before answering. That mattered because she was old enough now to hear something better than slogans. "Ruin is a hungry appetite," I said. "If you feed it too long, it starts eating the person holding it." She was quiet for a while, then said, "So what was the point?" "The point was to stop them from writing the ending for me." She stared out the window and smiled a little. Not because the answer was cheerful, because it was exact. Nora always preferred exact. There are pieces of those weeks that deserve telling, because rot like that never grows in one clean line. It grows through ordinary evenings, through late dinners, through comments that pass too quickly to challenge in the moment, through people teaching you, gently and repeatedly, not to trust the evidence of your own discomfort. One Tuesday, 4 days after I came home from the hospital, Celeste invited Dr. Hale to the house under the pretense of a recovery follow-up. That part was legitimate. Dr. Hale came with a blood pressure cuff, a clipped expression, and the kind of posture physicians get when they know they are walking into domestic theater but have not yet decided where the exits are. Celeste had arranged the room before the doctor arrived. Blanket folded on the sofa, medication box visible, 2 untouched bowls in the sink to imply domestic strain, a legal pad left open on the side table with the words memory patterns written across the top in Celeste's narrow handwriting. It was subtle enough that a stranger might have missed it. Dr. Hale did not miss it. She examined me in the den while Celeste stood near the doorway radiating concern. Questions about dizziness, questions about sleep, questions about headaches. Then, almost casually, Celeste asked whether cognitive fluctuation after arrhythmia could sometimes appear more strongly in familiar environments than in clinical ones. Dr. Hale looked at her in a way I will always appreciate. Not rude, not warm, just alert. "Are you asking a medical question," she said, "or trying to create a category?" Celeste actually smiled at that. The woman had nerve, I will give her that. "I'm trying to be proactive," she said. We all are, Dr. Hale replied. Then she turned back to me and asked me 3 simple orientation questions, 1 short memory task, and 2 executive function questions involving sequences and choices. I answered them cleanly, not performatively, just correctly. Celeste's jaw moved once, barely, but I saw it. Before Dr. Hale left, she asked to speak to me alone on the porch. She did not lower her voice. That mattered. Doctors who have decided to remain neutral tend to whisper. Doctors who have decided not to be used tend to speak at full volume and dare the room to object. She told me my recovery was physically good, neurologically reassuring, and socially complicated. Those were her exact words. Then she added, "If anyone in your house keeps trying to convert fatigue into incompetence, call me before they call anybody else." I liked her more than was probably medically appropriate. That same week, Gavin began visiting more often. Not in obvious ways. He was too experienced around plausible deniability for obviousness. He would stop by with bagels for Nora. He would mention a client concern and then immediately say there was no need for me to think about it. He would ask whether I wanted him to move certain decisions off my plate for now. Always for now. People reaching for permanence love temporary language. One afternoon, I found him in my study standing in front of the cabinet where I kept old partnership agreements, archived insurance files, and the original debt restructure from our second expansion year. He had not opened anything yet, or at least he had closed it before I arrived, but he was standing too close to that cabinet for innocence. "Looking for something?" I asked. He turned with that quick little grin brothers use when they want history to do the work of absolving them. "Remembering where you hide the boring stuff," he said, "in case you need help." I leaned against the doorway and let the silence extend. Gavin filled silence the way cheap drywall fills with moisture. Fast and badly. "I'm just trying to be useful," he added. "I know," I said. "That's the part that makes me cautious." He laughed, not comfortably. After he left, I checked the cabinet. Nothing missing, but the folder edges had shifted. Not enough to matter in court, enough to matter in my head. That is something liars never fully understand about men who build things. We notice alignment, we notice weight, we notice when something has been handled, even if it was returned carefully. Nora noticed more than either of them gave her credit for. That Friday, she came into my study after school and asked a question with the false casualness teenagers use when they are already certain the answer is bad. "Did Mom always hate this house?" I looked up from an email chain Ezra had flagged. "What do you mean?" "She talks like it trapped her." Nora shrugged. "But she only says it when she thinks she's explaining something to Uncle Gavin." That sentence sat between us. I motioned for her to sit. "What exactly have you heard?" Nora crossed her arms. "She says you love the company more than the family. She says the house was built to impress clients, not to live in. She says if things change after the board meeting, maybe everybody can breathe again." "The board meeting. Yeah." Nora looked at me carefully now. "She doesn't know I know about it." That was one of the moments I understood how much of this story would end up sitting in my daughter's nervous system for years. Not just the betrayal. The listening. The way children in endangered homes become archivists. I asked whether Celeste had said anything else. Nora nodded, then repeated, with more accuracy than I wanted, a phrase Celeste had used the night before while on speaker with someone she did not realize Nora could hear from the hallway. "If Adrian pushes too hard, we go medical first. No one argues with medical." That line deserved a frame. Not because it was poetic, because it was the clearest blueprint anyone had given us yet. Ezra added it to the legal timeline that evening. Mallory added a note beside it in blue ink. Language of sequencing, not fear. Planned escalation confirmed. Those 3 words changed the emotional shape of everything for me. Planned escalation confirmed. Not a bad affair, not a family in grief making sloppy choices. A sequence. Pressure, countermove, paper, witness, asset shift. The next morning before anyone else woke up, I walked through the house, room by room. Kitchen, dining room, mudroom, patio, Nora's old art cabinet near the stairs. The den where Celeste had arranged my fragility-like decor. The office where Gavin had been too close to my files. I was not looking for one big revelation. I was looking for pattern. Pattern tells you where a system has already begun to replace a home. What I found in Celeste's closet was not dramatic. No love letters tied in ribbon, no burner phone glowing in the dark, just a cream notebook tucked behind 2 storage boxes. Inside were pages of lists in her handwriting. Nora's schedule, medication schedule, board names with short descriptions, phrases to avoid with Adrian, phrases that calm him, phrases that trigger defensiveness. Gavin to call May if needed. Use Hale carefully. Fatigue more credible than confusion. Never say incapacity first. Let others suggest it. I stood there holding that notebook and thinking the same thing I had thought in the ICU while the machine beside me proved I was still alive. Not rage. Precision. Rage would have made me confront her on the spot. Precision let me photograph every page, return the notebook exactly where it had been, and eat breakfast across from her while she asked whether my chest felt tight and whether I remembered to take the blue pill after the white one. I smiled and said yes to both. The blue pill came later. The white one first. But that morning, I preferred her confidence to my correction. It is strange. The things that become intimate after trust dies. Not touch, not sex, not marriage. Timing, sequence. How long someone looks at you after a lie. Whether their hand pauses half a second over your coffee cup before they ask a question they already know how they want answered. I learned my wife more thoroughly after she stopped being mine than I ever had while I still believed she was. The company side of it was uglier because businesses preserve betrayal in cleaner handwriting. Mallory called me into Ezra's office on the Thursday before the board meeting and spread the vendor histories across the conference table, like a pathologist laying out photographs no family wants to see. Strategic Continuity Review, Executive Resilience Partner, Governance Transition Advisory. All the titles had that polished consultant smell to them. Soft words with expensive invoices. The sort of language designed to sound inevitable to directors who are too busy to ask how many syllables they are paying for. Start with this one, Mallory said. She pointed to Strategic Continuity Review. Invoices modest at first, then larger, then tied to travel. Then tied to a deposit that looped through 2 accounts before landing near the waterfront property in Annapolis. She had mapped it with color-coded arrows that made the whole thing look less like accounting and more like plumbing designed by snakes. Who approved it? I asked. Officially, she said. You did. I looked up. She slid a document toward me. Electronic approval trail, time-stamped. My login, my authority, my name. Only the timestamp put the approval at 4:13 a.m. on a Sunday when I had been in Chicago sleeping in a hotel room beside a convention center with 2 of my senior estimators and one truly unforgettable case of food poisoning from a lobster roll that should have been illegal. That's fake. Technically, it's unauthorized credential use, Mallory said. But yes, in plain English, fake. She had more. An internal permissions change Gavin requested to streamline recovery contingency sign-off. A proposed amendment to our client reassurance language that would have allowed temporary executive continuity messaging to go out before a formal vote if a family confirmed health instability. A draft press response, not full release, just holding language. Mercer Build Group has enacted a temporary leadership bridge while Adrian Mercer focuses on health and neurological rest. Neurological rest. I stared at that phrase so long, Ezra had to ask whether I was still hearing him. This is the part nobody glamorous ever tells you about white-collar betrayal. It is not clever in the cinematic sense. It is administrative. Attachment folders, revised PDFs, calendar holds, pre-written talking points. People are always waiting for evil to feel dramatic. Most of the time, it feels like an assistant who came in early. Mallory found 3 things that mattered most. First, Gavin had been laying groundwork with 2 board members who liked him because he arrived warm, deferential, and eager to reduce burden. Weak men often read those traits as loyalty. They mistake emotional convenience for character. Second, Celeste had been feeding him domestic details designed to look spontaneous when repeated later. Adrian is sleeping in 2-hour stretches. Adrian gets overwhelmed after long calls. Adrian has trouble tracking dinner conversations. Adrian seems different. The line between household concern and legal strategy had been erased so carefully it almost deserved academic study. Third, and ugliest, they had not built this after I collapsed. They had accelerated it after I collapsed. The first vendor appeared months earlier. The Annapolis property had been viewed twice before the ICU. The shell structures were younger than the affair, but older than the emergency. This mattered because it killed the last generous interpretation. No panic, no grief, no confusion. Opportunity, yes, but opportunity, meeting preparation. I asked Mallory when she had first suspected something. She leaned back, folded her hands, and said, "When a healthy company suddenly pays strangers to describe succession risk in vague language, someone inside is preparing to counterfeit uncertainty." That sentence stayed with me. Counterfeit uncertainty. That was exactly it. They were not trying to prove I was incapable. They were trying to create enough fog that moving around me would look prudent. Ezra spent that afternoon building the legal spine under our response. Independent governance clause, temporary protective trust, emergency board chair authority, authentication challenge on all new vendor approvals, preservation notice, potential civil fraud exposure. The paperwork itself was not glamorous. That made it beautiful. Predators count on decent people becoming exhausted before the documents do. I had no intention of tiring first. May Donnelly arrived at 6 that evening with a raincoat, a cane she used mostly for emphasis, and the sort of stare that made younger men sit straighter before they even understood why. May had chaired our board once before I took the company fully private and partially back again through debt restructuring. She knew every version of Mercer Build Group, including the broke one, especially the broke one. That is why I trusted her. She listened to the whole outline without interrupting. Notebook closed, hands folded over the cane handle. No gasps, no moral theater. When Ezra finished, she looked at me and asked, "Are you prepared to lose the marriage cleanly if that is the price of saving the company cleanly?" It was the right question. Not whether I was angry, not whether I was hurt, whether I understood cost. Yes, I said. She nodded once. Good. Men your age make fools of themselves when they still think humiliation can be negotiated privately after paper this ugly. Then she asked to see Nora's statement. Read it, set it down, and said something I did not expect. Do not let them make the child carry the moral center of this. Adults who weaponize a child once will do it again through sympathy if you hand them the chance. That changed our approach. We would use Nora's affidavit surgically, not theatrically. Enough to destroy the domestic fiction, not enough to turn my daughter into the face of our defense. That decision was May's. I was grateful for it immediately and more grateful later. Before she left, May walked with me to the lobby and tapped her cane once on the marble tile near reception. You know what the worst part is? She asked. Tell me. It is not that your brother wanted your chair. Brothers are disappointing all the time. She looked around the empty office. It is that they counted on your decency as infrastructure. That one landed hard, because it was true. They needed me not to want scandal, not to want public force, not to want my daughter near a fight, not to want the board embarrassed. My ethics were not merely things they exploited. They were part of the engineering. That evening, back at the house, Celeste asked whether the office tired me. I told her it did. She touched my wrist and said maybe I should let Gavin carry more for a while. Her thumb rested there half a second too long, as if tenderness could still be made to perform legitimacy. I looked at that hand and thought about the vendor trails, the lake house deposit, the notebook in her closet, and the phrase neurological rest. Then I kissed her forehead and said, You may be right. She slept soundly that night. I did not. Not because of heartbreak, because strategy is loud inside the mind, even when the house around you is quiet. I lay awake listening to the vents breathe and planning the geometry of Monday. Who sits where? Who speaks first? What gets said privately? What must be said in front of witnesses? What must never be said in anger, even if anger would feel good for 3 hot seconds? Revenge, if you want the truth of it, begins long before the strike. It begins when you stop asking whether people would really do this to you and start asking how they expect to survive once they do. The dinner itself was only the visible trap. What mattered more was everything we built around it. Ezra had the recorder ready, yes. Mallory had the vendor timeline ready. May had the governance authority ready. Dr. Hale had the medical statement ready. But I needed one more thing before Friday night. I needed to understand whether Celeste and Gavin were still lying to themselves, or whether they had reached the colder stage where people tell the truth privately because they believe the moral argument has already been settled in their favor. That was why I agreed to meet Celeste alone on Thursday afternoon. She suggested lunch at a place by the river where we used to go during the years when every restaurant bill felt like a reward we had earned for surviving bad quarters and worse subcontractors. I almost refused because nostalgia is a filthy stage to set for a legal conversation. Then I realized that was exactly why she chose it. Celeste always preferred terrain that came with emotional residue. People are easier to soften when the room remembers a better version of them. She wore dark green. I remembered the dress because memory gets sharp under threat. The waiter knew us. That made it worse. He smiled in the warm, automatic way people do around long marriages they assume still exist. Celeste smiled back like an actress who had been playing the same role for so long, she sometimes forgot where it ended. We made it through drinks before she touched the actual subject. How are you sleeping? How do you feel after long calls? Do you ever lose track of sequence mid-conversation? Careful questions. Soft voice. Professional concern draped over intimacy. Halfway through the main course, she leaned in and said, Adrian, I need you to hear this as love, not attack. Nothing honest has ever started well with that sentence. She told me people were worried. She told me the board might prefer a temporary continuity bridge if I appeared defensive. She told me Gavin had been carrying more than was fair. She told me the kindest version of the next few months might be one where I let structure hold things until I had properly rested. Then she reached across the table and squeezed my fingers as if she was gifting me mercy. Do you know what happens to men like you when they don't relinquish gracefully? She asked. They become cautionary stories in their own offices. That was the moment I understood she had crossed the last invisible line. Not because she wanted to leave, not because she wanted money, because she had begun to enjoy explanation. People who still feel conflicted lie quickly and flee. People who have built a private moral permission structure want to teach it to you. So I let her teach. I asked whether she believed I was actually unstable. She hesitated, not long, just enough, then said, I believe you are not the man you were 6 months ago. There it was. A true sentence carrying false cargo. I was not the man I had been 6 months earlier. That man still trusted his wife and his brother. That man still believed exhaustion counted as presence in a marriage if the money was good enough. That man still thought family loyalty was the default soil under a business. She was right. I was different, just not in the direction she needed. I asked whether she loved Gavin. Her eyes did the smallest possible thing, not shock, annoyance. What difference does that make now? That answer told me everything. Love may have been part of it once. By then they were joined by design, not romance. The affair had become a project. I asked whether she thought Nora would forgive her. She looked out toward the river before answering. That depends which version she grows up believing. That line burned itself into me, not because of its cruelty, because of its confidence. She really believed identity itself could be edited through repetition and sequence. Tell the right story at the right moments. Control the terms. Choose what the child hears first. Select who looks credible, manage the adjectives, build the future. When lunch ended, she kissed my cheek in the parking lot. A tiny, intimate thing, disgustingly normal. Then she said, "Please don't make Friday harder than it has to be." I drove straight to Ezra's office after that and repeated the conversation word for word while Mallory added 3 new notes to the timeline. Language of graceful relinquishment, board pressure reference, child narrative management confirmed. At 4, Gavin called to check in. I let it ring twice before answering. He was all warmth, all brotherly concern, all practical affection. He asked whether Celeste had reached me. He said she was worried I might feel cornered. He said Friday did not have to become emotional if we were all adults. If we're all adults, I said, why does it feel like everyone keeps trying to make me agree to things before they name them? He chuckled, not comfortably. Because you always need too much context before you move. He thought that was criticism. It was the nearest thing to a compliment he had given me all year. That night, Nora asked whether she should stay in the house for dinner or sleep over with a friend. I told her the choice was hers. That mattered. I was tired of other adults deciding what participation looked like for her. She thought about it, then said, "I'm staying." I asked why. She said, "Because if they think I'm not part of the room, they'll say more." Again, that was my daughter. No melodrama, no slogans. Just exact risk assessment. I hated that she needed the skill. I loved that she had it. Friday afternoon, before everyone arrived, I walked through the house once more. The dining room had been laid too carefully, candles not lit but placed, good plates, Celeste's mother's silver, Gavin's favorite bourbon visible on the sideboard. The whole thing looked less like dinner and more like a merger dressed for a holiday. That was Celeste's talent. She could make predation feel curated. Ezra came through the side entrance at 7:15 and set the recorder in the study. He checked it twice, then looked at me and said, "One last chance to turn this into pure legal containment." "No," I said, "they need to hear themselves." He nodded. "Then let them teach." That line became the shape of the whole night. Let them teach. Not because I wanted wisdom from them, because people reveal themselves most fully when they think they are finally explaining reality to the only person too stubborn to accept it. At dinner, Gavin tried charm first. Stories from the early days. A memory about our father yelling at both of us over a ruined lumber order. A joke about me firing 3 project managers in 1 month because none of them understood weather contingencies. He wanted the room to remember older versions of us before the knives came out. Celeste supported him with warmth and refills and little shoulder touches that once would have meant alliance. I let the meal breathe. I asked Nora about school. I asked Celeste's mother about her knee. I poured Gavin more bourbon than he should have had because loose men reveal more than sober ones. When we moved to the study afterward, the air changed. Not dramatically, just enough. People think rooms change because voices get louder. Usually they change because performance gets more efficient. Gavin opened with concern. Celeste followed with burden. I waited. That is the part people misunderstand about silence. Silence is not absence. In the right moment, it is pressure. They filled it, beautifully. By the time Celeste accused me of loving the company more than the family, and Gavin hinted the board was already uneasy, they had walked themselves exactly where I wanted them. Not into scandal, into explanation. An explanation under tension is where private entitlement turns public. What happened after Monday mattered almost as much as Monday itself. People like to imagine revenge as the clean apex, the reveal, the humiliation, the room turning, the guilty faces going pale. That is a child's understanding of power. Real damage arrives in the days after, when consequences begin learning addresses. Gavin did not vanish after security walked him out. He tried 3 different versions of survival in 8 days. First came anger. He called me from an unknown number that afternoon and told me I had overreacted. That word almost made me admire him. Overreacted. As if I had raised my voice at Thanksgiving instead of dismantled a fraudulent governance play supported by fabricated medical narratives and shell vendors. He said the board move would have helped the company. He said the Annapolis house was not what I thought. He said Celeste had been miserable for years. He said if I kept pressing, we would all lose more than we needed to. Then came sorrow. The next day, he sent a 6-paragraph email about our father. How disappointed he would be. How family men should settle things in rooms, not in filings. How brothers who built something together should not let outsiders define the conflict. Outsiders. by which he meant lawyers, accountants, auditors, and anybody else whose professional weakness was documentation. Then came strategy. That was the only honest phase. By Friday, Gavin's counsel had proposed a narrow containment deal. He would resign quietly from all positions. He would cooperate on the vendor tracing. He would avoid disputing the authority structure. In return, I would keep his name out of any public narrative connected to the fabricated health concerns, not because he felt remorse, because he wanted to preserve future employability. Ezra read the proposal twice and looked up at me. Your brother is trying to buy reputation with the only currency he still thinks you care about. What currency is that? Silence, I declined. Not theatrically. Not absolutely. I declined the terms as written and made a cleaner offer. Full cooperation, full disclosure, full financial restoration where possible. No guarantees about reputational consequence outside confidentiality already required by law. That was the part he hated. He wanted consequence managed. I wanted it accurately released into the world. Celeste's path was uglier because domestic betrayal always drags soft tissue with it. For 3 days, she alternated between contempt and grief. At noon, she would message me through counsel about property timing and document access. At 5, she would email personally about whether we really had to do this like strangers. At midnight, she would send nothing at all, and then appear in the kitchen at 6 the next morning looking as if sleep itself had become politically complicated. One dawn, while Nora was still upstairs and the house still held that pre-sunrise silence that makes every spoon against ceramic sound accusatory, Celeste asked whether there had ever been a point where I would have forgiven her. That question deserved a true answer. Too much else in our marriage had been built on delayed honesty. Yes, I said. Her eyes came up immediately. Before the planning, I added. Before the child. Before the shells. Before you taught yourself to call my removal continuity. She stood there in her robe, holding a coffee mug with both hands, like warmth itself might argue her case. I was drowning in that house, she said. You were never there. That hurt because it was not wholly false. I had been absent in ways ambition disguises efficiently. I had brought contracts home, missed dinners, answered site calls during Nora's recitals by stepping into the lobby and telling myself proximity still counted. That part was mine. I do not respect men who rewrite themselves spotless once betrayal gives them the chance. But truth does not become innocent just because it contains one accurate ingredient. You could have left, I said again. You could have taken your share and gone. You could have told me I had become unbearable. You could have told the truth while it was still just pain. I looked at her over the rim of my cup. Instead, you turned pain into architecture. She cried then. Not the pretty, strategic kind she had once used on doctors and neighbors. The real exhausted kind that rearranges breathing and makes the face briefly honest. I believed that some part of her was grieving the marriage. I also believed that grief had arrived years too late to make moral claims on me. Nora was the line I guarded hardest. The board fight I could handle. The civil exposure I could handle. The marital wreckage, ugly as it was, I could handle. What I would not let happen was a slow educational poisoning in my daughter's head. Children do not need every fact. They need stable reality. Who is lying? Who is safe? Who decides what happens next? Everything else can come later. So I made 3 rules with Ezra and the therapist we brought in for Nora. No one would ask her to repeat the same statement to multiple adults if one would do. No one would let either parent use her as a courier. No adult would make her responsible for managing anyone's heartbreak. Those rules sound simple. They are not. Adults in collapse are greedy with children's attention. We use them to test our innocence, to request comfort, to harvest sympathy. I had no intention of letting my house become that kind of place 1 minute longer. There was one evening, about 2 weeks after the board meeting, when Nora sat across from me in the den with a bowl of cereal because dinner had become optional for both of us and said, "Mom keeps trying to talk to me like she's the reasonable one in a documentary." I laughed before I could help it, then regretted it. Then saw Nora almost smile and let the laugh stand. "What does that mean?" I asked. "She talks like everything happened because adults had complicated pressures, like no one chose anything, like this is all weather." Nora put the spoon down. I hate weather language. So did I. I had been hearing it everywhere. Circumstances, complexity, pressure, transition, fragility. Nobody willing to say the actual verbs: planned, moved, approved, misused, lied, prepared. That night I told Nora something I wish someone had told me younger. Anytime a person keeps talking about complexity before they have admitted choice, they are probably trying to wash fingerprints off the story. She nodded slowly, then said, "That sounds like something I should write down." She did. Later I found it in the margin of a chemistry worksheet. That, more than most formal therapy language, convinced me she would survive us. The civil case over the vendors opened another door I had not expected. Email retention, device imaging, calendar recovery, travel records. You learn a great deal about people once software stops accepting their preferred narrative tone. Mallory found a chain between Gavin and one of the shell consultants where Gavin referred to me as the pillar. Not admiringly. Functionally. If Adrian moves cleanly, the pillar remains useful during transition. If he fights, we pivot to fatigue and household corroboration. Household corroboration. That was Celeste. That was Nora, if they had gotten their way. That was the whole plan in 2 words. Turn a family into evidentiary terrain. When Ezra read that line aloud, he went very still. You understand, he said. This is the phrase that kills them. Why this one? Because it proves intent to manufacture the domestic side of a governance event. They are not observing decline. They are planning corroboration. That was the week I stopped thinking of what they had done as betrayal alone. Betrayal is intimate. This had become industrial. 3 weeks after Monday, Gavin requested an in-person conversation with no lawyers. I almost refused. Then I remembered something my grandfather used to say about rotten beams. If you are going to inspect one, inspect it where the light is good enough to see the insects run. So I met him in a private room at an old steakhouse off Route 50, a place our father loved because the waiters had learned long ago not to hover near men discussing work that might later become lawsuits. Gavin looked tired, not morally, administratively. He had not yet learned the difference. He said the same thing compromised people always say when the paperwork catches up. This got bigger than it was meant to. No, I said. It got visible. He drank half his water in one go and stared at the tablecloth. You think I wanted all this? I think wanting is less important than choosing. He looked up then with something almost like anger. You had everything, he said. That's what you never understood. There are grievances people carry for so long they mistake them for ethical structure. That was Gavin. He had spent years narrating my competence as dominance, my caution as control, my earned authority as humiliation for everyone who lacked it. In his head, theft had become redistribution. You were always the one people called, he said. Dad, then the site guys, then the board, then the banks. Even when I did the work, they still looked to you. That's not a crime, no, but it does something to a man. That was one of the truest things he said in the whole process. Resentment does do something to a man. If he feeds it long enough, it begins rewriting memory until every ordinary unfairness becomes justification for extraordinary corruption. I asked him quietly whether he had ever loved Nora. The question startled him. Good. I wanted something in him startled at last. Of course I did. Then why were you willing to turn her into corroboration? He had no answer. Not because there was no explanation, because every available explanation revealed the scale of his decay. We sat there in silence until the waiter asked if we needed anything. Neither of us did. When Gavin finally stood to leave, he said, You know, if you had been softer, none of this would have happened. That was the sentence he wanted as his inheritance. Not money, not title. That sentence. The one where the betrayed man somehow still explains the thief. I let him walk away, carrying it alone. The legal collapse of a family is not one event. It is weather in reverse. Rooms clearing out, schedules breaking apart, objects losing who they belong to, a toothbrush removed from a sink, a coat no longer on the hook by the mudroom, Nora's headphones abandoned on the piano because she forgot them in the middle of crying and refused to come back downstairs while Celeste was still in the house. For 6 weeks, we lived in a place that looked normal from the street and felt post-impact from the inside. Celeste moved into the guest room first, under advice from counsel. Then into a corporate apartment arranged through one of the same women who used to send us holiday centerpieces and congratulatory bottles of wine whenever the company landed a major contract. That was humiliating in a strangely practical way. The ecosystems of success never tell you how quickly they become ecosystems of separation once the invoices change. The day she left, she stood in the foyer with 2 suitcases and 1 garment bag and asked Nora if she wanted to come with her for a few nights just for space. Nora said no, without looking up from her phone. Not rude, not dramatic, just clean. Celeste waited. I think she expected the refusal to wobble if given another 3 seconds. It did not. Then she turned to me, not with apology, with something more exhausted and more dangerous than apology. Expectation. As if the civilized thing would be for me to rescue her from the visual consequences of leaving her own home under a cloud she built. So I opened the front door and said, "Traffic will be better if you take the bridge before 5. She actually laughed once, tiny, disbelieving. Then she walked out. I did not watch from the window. That mattered to me. Nora did, from the upstairs landing where she thought I could not see her. After the car disappeared, she came downstairs and said, she kept waiting for someone to make it less real. That line sat with me for months, maybe because it named something bigger than our house. There are people who can do terrible things and still expect the world to cushion the optics for them once truth arrives. School became its own battlefield, not because of scandal. We kept Nora's name out of anything public, but because children can smell fracture even when adults are technically discreet. Friends ask questions. Parents became warmer in that artificial, overcareful way people do when they know something happened but have no idea what the right ratio of curiosity to decency looks like. Nora hated all of it. One evening, she came home from debate practice and threw her bag onto the floor with enough force to qualify as commentary. Then she said, "Everybody wants me to be either devastated or inspiring." I was in the kitchen slicing lemons. I looked up and said, "How inconvenient of you to be neither on command." That got a real laugh. Then she cried in the pantry while I pretended to look for black pepper and stood close enough that silence did not become abandonment. The company recovered faster than the house. That is one of the crueler jokes of adulthood. Institutions, if structured well, often heal cleaner than intimacy. May held the board together with a kind of stern grace I will be grateful for until the day I die. Mallory tightened every approval channel until a butterfly would have needed a password to cross accounts payable. Ezra built a litigation map that looked like somebody had taken my marriage, my governance documents, and my medical chart and turned them into a battlefield surveyed by a very bitter cartographer. Clients asked questions. Not many. Important ones. Was leadership stable? Would the municipal garage stay on timeline? Did the continuity event affect bonding capacity? Did it compromise signatory authority on the Virginia schools package? I answered those questions myself. Not because I wanted to prove anything, because the fastest way to kill a counterfeit incapacity narrative is to operate clearly in public. I remember the first major call after Monday. 3 bank officers, 2 client reps, 1 external auditor who spoke as if commas cost him money. I took the call from conference room A while Nora was doing algebra upstairs, and the rain started hard enough against the glass to blur the parking lot into abstraction. By the end of the call, one of the client reps said, "Adrian, you sound remarkably steady under the circumstances." I thanked him, hung up, sat there looking at the blank screen for 10 seconds, then laughed. Not because it was funny, because I realized how deeply insulting the last few weeks had been. I had nearly died. I had uncovered a family governance ambush. I had protected my daughter from coached testimony. And somewhere beneath all of that, part of me still felt compelled to perform steadiness for men in navy blazers so nobody could turn medical vocabulary into ownership language again. That is the residue betrayal leaves. Even after you win, you keep checking whether the room has truly stopped evaluating your right to remain in it. Celeste tried twice to take back narrative ground through intimacy, once in writing, once in person. The letter arrived by courier because of course it did. 5 pages, cream paper, no legal headers, all emotional texture. She wrote about loneliness, about how marriages can die in incremental silence long before anyone cheats, about how she had felt like a supporting character in the company story for years, about Gavin making her feel visible, about panic after my collapse, about fear, bad choices, momentum, and how quickly bad structures can form once people believe they are already trapped inside them. It was not a stupid letter, that made it harder. Stupid letters are easy to hate. This one contained intelligence, partial truth, and no actual innocence. I read it twice, then handed it to Ezra. He read it once and said, "She's trying to move from architect to witness." That was exactly right. Not denying the building, just changing her role in who designed it. The in-person attempt happened outside Nora's therapist's office 3 weeks later. She had chosen the time on purpose. I know that because Celeste's car was parked too precisely and her face looked prepared, not spontaneous. She wanted to catch me in the emotional spill zone after a session involving our daughter. A smart move if I had still been the man who believed emotional proximity made truth softer. She asked whether we could talk for 10 minutes. I said yes because public parking lots are often safer than private rooms when unfinished love and active litigation share a sentence. She told me she knew I thought the notebook in her closet proved everything. That line caught my attention. I had never mentioned the notebook. Neither had Ezra. Neither had Mallory, which meant she had guessed. Good. Let her wonder how many surfaces had already started talking. She asked whether I truly believed she had planned every step before the hospital. I told her the timeline suggested preparation before panic and acceleration after panic. That was the cleanest answer. She looked out through the windshield for a moment and said, "You always preferred nouns to pain." I almost smiled. "You preferred mood to accountability." That landed. Then she asked the most revealing question she had asked since the whole thing started. "Is there any version of this where you let me remain your friend to Nora? Not co-parent, not mother, friend." That was when I understood she still did not fully grasp what had been broken. Not the marriage, authority, safety, meaning. My daughter had been asked to perform instability in her own father. Friendship was not the category under review. "No," I said, "not until she chooses categories for herself without either of us arranging them first." Celeste cried then, quietly, car hood behind her, traffic passing 3 rows over. Nothing cinematic. Just a woman finally discovering that emotional fluency does not always reopen doors. There were moments in that season when I almost hated myself for not hating her more simply. It would have been easier, cleaner. Instead, I kept running into the same unpleasant truth. She had really suffered inside the marriage in some ways. I had failed in some ways. And none of that reduced what she chose after. Adults spend a great deal of time trying to find formulas where their pain and their wrongdoing cancel each other out. They do not. At best, they explain the weather. They do not excuse arson. Nora started spending Sundays with May by choice, not because May was warm in the expected grandmotherly way, because May spoke to her like intelligence was a normal human trait instead of a burdened child's compensation. They had coffee and terrible pastries and talked about architecture, contracts, colleges, and why men who say, with all due respect, usually have none left in inventory. That did more for my daughter than almost any formal intervention. Sometimes healing arrives disguised as a 72-year-old woman insulting governance language over burnt scones. One Sunday evening, Nora came home from May's and asked whether I wanted to know the difference between guilt and responsibility. I said yes, because any parent who says no to that question deserves whatever comes next. Guilt, she said, hanging her coat, is what people keep if they still want the story to stay centered on how they feel. She set her bag down. Responsibility is what they do when they agree the story isn't about them anymore. I stared at her. What? May had taught her that. Or maybe merely made room for the sentence to exist. Either way, I wrote it down later. Not because it was wise, because it was useful. There are sentences that help you carry years more cleanly once someone finally speaks them aloud. That winter I slept badly and worked too well. Classic male recovery. The body keeps going. The mind starts inventorying shadows at 3 a.m. I would wake up and hear Celeste's line again. If he starts talking like this in front of the board, push the fatigue angle, or Nora's. She used the word girl, or Gavin's. If Adrian moves cleanly, the pillar remains useful. Those were the sounds the house made now after everyone else had gone quiet. Not footsteps, not plumbing. Language. Language reclassifying itself from memory to artifact. By January, the civil pressure had forced enough document turnover that even Gavin's lawyer stopped pretending this had been a misunderstanding born from medical panic. We found calendar syncs, draft talking points, expense forecasts for the Annapolis property, a mock transition memo Gavin saved twice under different names as if duplication could become deniability. There was one attachment, buried 3 folders deep, that I still remember with perfect clarity. A spreadsheet titled Bridge Model, columns for timing, authority, narrative, asset protection, domestic alignment. They had a column for the family, not feelings, alignment. Mallory printed it and slid it across my desk without commentary. She did not need commentary. Some documents speak in a voice so ugly you do not improve them by paraphrasing. That night I took Nora out for burgers because if life is bleeding from 8 directions at once, you still need stupid ordinary salt and grease at least once a week. Halfway through the meal she asked whether I had ever been afraid. Not of the hospital, not of dying, of becoming what they said. That question deserves honesty too. Yes, I said, for about 4 days. She looked up. Really? Yes, because if enough people tell the world you are diminished, part of you starts checking whether you missed it. That's the filth of a strategy like theirs. It doesn't just try to move paper, it tries to colonize self-doubt. She sat with that, then nodded slowly. I'm glad you were too stubborn for it. Me too. That was the season. Not one explosion, 1,000 precise corrections, and somewhere inside them, a father and daughter learning how to keep a house from becoming a courtroom even while the legal war raged outside every room. Trial preparation changed me in ways the divorce never did. Divorce is intimate bureaucracy. Trial prep is excavation. You stop asking what happened and start asking what can be proven, by whom, with what sequence, under what pressure, against what denial. It strips romance off memory. Sometimes that is mercy. The state's fraud angle moved slower than the civil side, but landed harder once it started. Not because prosecutors were dramatic, because they were patient. Patient people terrify liars more than angry people do. Anger can be provoked. Patience just keeps opening folders. Assistant State's Attorney Lena Morris took my statement in a room with no art on the walls, one pitcher of water and fluorescent light harsh enough to flatten everybody into the version of themselves paper would later recognize. She was younger than I expected, not soft, not theatrical. She listened the way surgeons look before an incision. Intent, not sympathetic. When I finished the first sweep of the story, she asked one question that shifted the whole thing. At what point did you realize they were not simply trying to benefit from your collapse, but actively planning to narrate it? I said, when I stopped hearing concern and started hearing categories. She nodded. Good. Juries understand categories better than motives if you show them the sequence. Then she built the sequence out loud. Medical questioning, domestic scripting, vendor movement, property deposit, governance timing, child coaching, advisory language, settlement behavior. It sounded even uglier once somebody with subpoena power said it in a clean monotone. That was useful. Ugly things should be made to sit under bad light. Lena wanted everything, not just the dramatic bits. Not just the notebook. Not just Nora's line about practice testimony. Everything. Who first said fatigue? Who first used continuity? Who first positioned Gavin as practical relief? Who had access to my credentials? Which mornings Celeste suddenly started asking about sequence and sleep? Which directors Gavin had been courting socially? Who referred the shell consultants? Who drafted the holding language? Who suggested the river lunch? Who chose the timing of the Friday dinner? This is how real cases differ from living inside them. In life, betrayal comes as weather. In prosecution, it becomes a ladder. You climb it rung by rung until motive turns into sequence and sequence turns into conduct. I gave them everything I had, then went home and shook for 20 minutes in the downstairs bathroom where Nora could not hear me. That part matters too. Not because it is heroic, because people imagine men like me experience revenge as control from start to finish. No. We control behavior. The body still keeps score. Sometimes I would finish a perfect meeting, a clean legal call, an exact statement, and then find myself standing in the utility room unable to remember why my hands were shaking. Trauma does not always announce itself with collapse. Sometimes it just asks the body to re-argue the same case at 3 random hours of the day. Nora began therapy in earnest that spring, not crisis management. Real therapy, the kind where you get worse for a while because you stop performing competence long enough to understand what it cost. I drove her every Wednesday after school. Sometimes she talked in the car after. Sometimes she wore headphones and stared out the passenger side window as if the whole city had become a subtitled documentary she did not need to narrate yet. One Wednesday she asked, out of nowhere, "Do you think Mom loved me while she was doing all this?" There are no good fatherly shortcuts through a question like that. You either respect it or you fail the child answering it. "Yes," I said finally. "In some way, yes. In a broken way? Yes," she nodded, then looked down at her thumbnail. "I hate that broken love still counts." So did I, but false comfort would have insulted both of us. "It counts," I said. "It just doesn't get to erase what it did." That answer did not soothe her. Good. Some truths are not for soothing. They are for building reality that can hold weight. The prosecutor's office wanted one meeting with Nora, just one. Trauma-informed, recorded, controlled, not to build the case on her, to understand exposure and corroboration. I asked her 3 separate times if she wanted me in the room. Each time she said no, not because she did not trust me, because she was done being looked at through another person's emotion. When she came out 90 minutes later, she looked pale and furious. I bought her fries and drove to the overlook by the old water tower because open sky sometimes helps after institutional rooms. We sat on the hood of the car with cold wind and salt and traffic humming below us. "What did they ask?" I said. She leaned back on her palms. Whether Mom ever told me exactly what to say. Whether Uncle Gavin ever said I'd be helping. Whether I believed you were actually confused. "And," she snorted, "I told them confusion and fatigue are not the same thing unless adults want them to be." I turned my head and looked at her. "That's good. It's true. Yes." Then she asked whether truth was enough. Not enough to win. Enough to stop feeling contaminated by what other people did around you. I told her I did not know yet. That was the most respectful answer I had. She accepted it. That is another thing older children do once they have been forced to grow the wrong muscles too early. They stop demanding certainty from adults and start measuring whether adults can tolerate not having it. The deposition phase with Celeste was harder than the board fight. At the board, roles were still clear. Chair, counsel, documents, votes, public geometry. In deposition, betrayal becomes conversational, close range, no audience, every word preserved, no dramatic relief. Just your former wife sitting across from you in a navy suit explaining why language like fragility and fatigue emerged naturally inside a household under strain. She kept returning to context. Marriage strain, my distance, my work habits, my perfectionism, my temperament during build crises. Again, partial truths. Always partial truths. That was her best remaining strategy. Flood the room with enough real unhappiness that planned predation might blur at the edges. Ezra dismantled it patiently. Not by denying the marriage was failing, by sequencing the conduct that followed. You say you were overwhelmed. Why the shell consultants? You say you feared his health. Why the lake house deposit before the ICU? You say Gavin merely supported you. Why the draft memo with interim authority language? You say you never meant to involve the child. Why the practice line? You say the notebook was self-regulation. Why the phrases to avoid and phrases that calm him? She held longer than I expected. Then Ezra put the bridge model spreadsheet in front of her and asked about domestic alignment. For the first time in the entire deposition, she lost rhythm. "What does that refer to?" he asked. No answer. "What does domestic alignment refer to, Celeste?" Her lawyer objected. She adjusted her sleeve, took water, looked at the document as if repetition might improve it. Then she said, "Household narrative stability." There it was, maybe the ugliest phrase of the whole case. Household narrative stability. Children inside it. Marriage inside it. My near death inside it. All converted into a management field. I left that deposition and sat in the parking garage for 15 full minutes without starting the car. Not because I was broken, because sometimes disgust has physical weight, and the body insists on acknowledging it before it lets you drive. Gavin's deposition was different. He came in too charming. That almost always means someone still thinks personality can negotiate around evidence. He tried the humble younger brother act, the burdened lieutenant, the practical family man pressed into impossible circumstances. He said continuity decisions were made under uncertainty. He said nobody intended harm. He said he believed the consultants were legitimate. He said the Annapolis house had been discussed as an investment vehicle, not a transition residence. Then Mallory produced the message where he wrote, "Once the pillar moves cleanly, the rest looks like care." He stopped being charming after that, not because shame arrived, because theater had failed. Lena later told me something about fraud that I still think about. The first lie usually protects appetite. The later lies protect self-image. That was Celeste. That was Gavin. By the time the case hardened, they were no longer fighting only for money or position. They were fighting to preserve a version of themselves in which they had responded to pressure intelligently instead of exploiting a medical emergency as a transition opportunity. Money starts schemes. Identity keeps them alive. Summer arrived while the filings were still multiplying. That offended me somehow. The indecency of weather continuing. Hydrangeas blooming. Contractors complaining about heat advisories. Teenagers at the marina. A world full of ordinary motion while my private life sat in indexed boxes, and yet ordinary motion helped. I began running again. Badly at first, then less badly. I repaired a warped fence gate myself one Sunday because paying someone else to fix a simple hinge felt intolerable after months of watching people monetize language around weakness. Nora planted tomatoes and then forgot to water them, and then rescued them too late, which she described as a valuable study in false hope. We laughed more carefully, then a little less carefully, then almost normally. One afternoon in August, May came by with peaches and looked around my kitchen as if inspecting a build site. "Better," she said. "What is?" "The house. It no longer feels like everybody's words are waiting in corners." She was right. That had changed. Not because pain was gone, because narrative control had shifted. No more hidden notebooks, no more staged pill displays, no more conversation engineered toward incapacity. The kitchen had become a kitchen again. That is an underrated form of victory. Before she left, May asked if I knew what part of the whole thing had made her angriest. I guessed the child. She said no. I guessed the vendors. She said no again. Then she told me. "The speed," she said. "The speed with which they converted illness into governance. That's the part that marks the soul." I knew exactly what she meant. The appetite. No mourning period. No moral lag. Just motion. That, more than the affair, was the wound I carried longest. Not that my wife loved another man. Not that my brother wanted my chair. That the people who knew my face best could hear machines keeping me alive and start counting leverage before the plastic tubing came out. You do not really forget a thing like that. You just learn to build a life that does not require forgetting. The hearing that finally settled the civil fraud pieces did not look like revenge. That is probably why it satisfied me. No shouting. No dramatic witness collapses. No surprise video played in a packed courtroom. Just one over-air-conditioned room, a bored clerk, a judge with a forehead line deep enough to suggest decades of encountering disappointing humans, and 4 hours of precise destruction. By then, the criminal side was still moving on its own slower track. This hearing dealt with the company loss pathways, unauthorized approvals, fiduciary breach, and the attempted governance shift. The language was drier, which made it even better. Dry language leaves predators fewer emotional curtains to hide behind. Mallory testified first. She walked the judge through the vendors, the approval anomalies, the property funding routes, and the sequence timing with the sort of patient clarity that makes dishonesty feel childish. She did not editorialize. That was the beauty of it. Predatory people are always waiting for outrage because outrage can be reframed as vendetta. Mallory gave them arithmetic instead. Then came the digital authentication expert, a narrow man with neat hair and no charm whatsoever. Perfect witness. He explained credential use, timestamp anomalies, and travel contradictions. At one point, he said, the approvals were not consistent with Mr. Mercer's device or location patterns. No drama. But I watched Gavin's lawyer stop writing for 3 full seconds. Celeste's counsel tried to build a softer world. Household distress, informal delegation, marital breakdown, miscommunication under medical strain. He wanted the judge to see emotional fog where we had spent months proving deliberate instrumentation. Then Ezra stood up and asked permission to mark the notebook pages, the bridge model sheet, and the household narrative references together as a combined intent sequence. Intent sequence. He had learned from Lena. Good lawyers steal elegant frameworks when they can use them cleanly. The judge read silently for a long time, long enough that even the air conditioning began to sound loud. Then she looked over her glasses and asked Celeste one question directly, not through counsel, her. "Mrs. Mercer, When exactly did concern for your husband's health become integrated with projected governance transition? That was the moment I knew she had already understood the entire shape. Celeste began answering in the language she preferred. Complexity, stress, fear, responsibilities. The judge stopped her with one small movement of the hand. No, she said. I am not asking when things felt difficult. I am asking when you began connecting his condition to control of assets and authority. Silence. Even now I admire that silence. Judges who know what a question is for are worth more than architecture. Celeste tried once more, then her lawyer intervened. Then the question was rephrased. But the damage had already been done. The room had reclassified her. Not wounded spouse, not overwhelmed mother, planner under oath. The order that came out of that hearing was not poetic. Again, good. Poetry would have reduced it. The judge found intentional misuse of internal authority mechanisms, improper approval pathways, material concealment in governance preparation, and conduct inconsistent with good faith, marital, or corporate stewardship. Good faith, marital, or corporate stewardship. I almost laughed right there. What a magnificent grave marker for people like Celeste and Gavin. Not evil, not monstrous, simply officially inconsistent with stewardship. That order unlocked the next chain. Insurance claim corrections. Recovered fee exposure, enhanced clawback rights, fee shifting, compelled production, protective expansion around Nora's materials. The machinery turned, slow, heavy, uninterested in their preferred emotions. Afterward, out in the hallway, Gavin tried one last brother move, no lawyers close enough to hear. Just him, me, and the terrible courthouse art behind us. You happy now? He asked. No, I said. Accurate. That's different. He shook his head like I had failed some private humanity test he still imagined himself qualified to administer. You always needed to win. No, I said again. I needed my life returned with the labels corrected. That shut him up because it was truer than victory. Winning suggests competition. He had mistaken theft for a contest. I was not there to beat him. I was there to stop him from holding paperwork over reality. Nora asked to read the order once it was final. Not the whole file. The order. I let her. She sat at the kitchen table with a yellow highlighter and read 3 pages in total silence. Then she highlighted one sentence and slid the packet back to me. The highlighted line read, "The court finds evidence of deliberate domestic narrative management in service of an attempted authority transfer." She tapped it once. "That's it," she said. "What is?" "That's the whole thing in adult language." She was right. Domestic narrative management. What a sterile phrase for what they had tried to do to our family. And yet some truths need sterile phrases to survive institutions. If you drag them in bleeding, people call them feelings. If you clean them first, sometimes the system finally lets them count. That fall, the criminal plea conversations began behind doors I did not enter. Lena kept me informed in clean outlines. Marcus's side exploring resolution without full allocution. Natalie seeking cooperation value. Gavin trying distance. Celeste resisting distance because she still believed even then that if she could make her motives sound sufficiently relational, the law might mistake them for less dangerous than they were. Lena told me a phrase from one of the proffer sessions that stayed in her throat afterward. Celeste had said she never meant to erase me. She had only meant to lower the temperature of my dominance until other people could function. Lower the temperature of my dominance. That was how she understood nearly dying and then being slowly repositioned out of my own company, a thermostat problem. I did not know whether to laugh or put my fist through drywall, so I made coffee instead. This is adulthood. Sometimes moral fury expresses itself through appliances because breaking the right thing is illegal and breaking the wrong thing is stupid. Marcus proved easier to hate and therefore easier to understand. By then, enough document turnover had shown the same pattern across other matters. Not rooms and families exactly like mine, but always the same instinct. Medical language expanding into control language, temporary becoming indefinite, concern becoming structure. He had spent years teaching people that the purest form of care was managed limitation under expert framing. In our house, with Celeste's ambition and Gavin's resentment feeding the system, that professional pathology found perfect soil. The licensing board hearing was not public in the dramatic sense, but word travels quickly when a physician loses the confidence of institutions that once prized his posture. He went from expensive calm to professional ghost in under 6 months. That did not heal anything. Good. Healing is not the job of consequences. Consequences are there to stop the wrong lesson from spreading. By winter, Nora had started leaving her bedroom door open again. That sounds small. It isn't. For months after the hospital, after the board fight, after the coached lines, she had kept it half closed unless friends were over. A controlled opening. Not secretive. Protective. Then one evening in November, I came home from the office and noticed the door wide open, music on, homework spread across the bed, and one of her terrible oversized sweaters hanging off the desk chair. I stood there looking at that open doorway longer than I should have, because safety does not always announce itself with speeches. Sometimes it just returns to habits. She caught me in the hall and said, "Why are you being weird?" I'm not being weird. You're standing there like the door solved climate change. I smiled. Maybe it did. She rolled her eyes and went back inside. Teenagers are a merciful species. They often refuse ceremony exactly when adults need it most. The first holiday season after the collapse was quieter than any Christmas I had ever known. No big house, no formal dinner, no Celeste orchestrating table settings, no Gavin arriving late with bottles too expensive for sincerity. Just me, Nora, two of her friends who had nowhere better to be on Christmas Eve, May for dessert, and Danny from the company because he would have considered exclusion a personal insult. We ate badly, too much butter, not enough coordination. A pie Nora burned at the edges and declared emotionally accurate. Halfway through the evening, May raised her glass and said, "Two uncurated rooms." It was the best toast I had heard all year. That was another thing the whole ordeal changed in me. I stopped admiring polished domestic performance, perfect tables, perfect holiday cards, perfect strategic warmth. I had seen too clearly what curation can hide when conscience goes missing. Give me a loud kitchen. Give me a burned pie. Give me a teenager swearing in the laundry room because the dog knocked over a tray. At least then the room belongs to itself. A month later, when one of the final settlement wires landed and the Annapolis property claim officially unwound, Ezra called and asked if I wanted to celebrate. I said no, then changed my mind and said yes. We went to a cheap bar near the harbor where nobody knew my history and the food was aggressive toward arteries. Halfway through the second drink, Ezra said, "You know what your real revenge was, right?" I assume you're about to tell me. You kept them from turning procedure into destiny. I sat with that. He was right. Money mattered. Authority mattered. Nora's safety mattered more than either. But the deepest thing at stake had been destiny. They had drafted a future in which I was still alive, but no longer authorial in my own life. Company elsewhere. Daughter narratively redirected. Health translated into diminished standing. My name preserved only where useful. That was the future I took back. Not because I won every piece. Because I refused the storyline they built before I woke up. If you ask me now, that is the heart of revenge in stories like this. Not punishment. Revision. Taking the ending back from people who started writing it while your body was still on a monitor. A long time after the lawyers quieted down, after the criminal side took its measured bites, after the last mandatory disclosures stopped arriving in thick envelopes and started arriving only as occasional updates, I found one more thing in the house. It was in a box from the attic marked old school. Nora and I had started clearing the place because keeping every object forever is just hoarding with grief jewelry on it. Inside were report cards, broken science fair ribbons, one ugly ceramic bowl Nora made in 6th grade that looked like it had been fired during a small earthquake, and a stack of old family photos from before money got good enough to confuse everybody. At the bottom sat a spiral notebook in my own handwriting. Field notes. That is what I used to call them in the early expansion years. Not journals, too indulgent for the man I was then. Field notes sounded practical enough to forgive. I sat on the attic floor and read entries from when Nora was 6, 8, 10, weather delays, cash flow panic, a subcontractor stealing copper, a school play I missed and told myself I had no choice about. Then a line from one spring 7 years before the hospital. Celeste said tonight that success is turning me into a guest who pays mortgage. Need to ask whether this is fatigue talking or something older. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Not because it exonerated anyone, because it proved something I had been resisting. I had heard the warning, not clearly enough, not bravely enough, but I had heard it. Then I did what men like me often do with complicated pain. I renamed it fatigue and returned to work. That was the closest thing to self-accusation I let myself keep. Not that I caused what followed. I did not. Not that neglect earned betrayal. It does not. Only this. There had been cracks before the demolition plan, and I had chosen productivity over investigation because productivity is often easier to survive in the short term than intimacy. I took the notebook downstairs and read that line to Nora over late coffee and stale cookies. She listened, then said, "So you knew something was wrong, but not what?" Yes. And she knew something was wrong, but chose the worst possible way to answer it. Yes. Nora thought about that, then nodded. That sounds more true than either hero or villain. That was another gift age gave her faster than I wanted. She had stopped needing every story to be pure in order to understand where blame still belonged. We sold the old house that spring, not because I could not financially keep it, because rooms collect instruction. And I no longer wanted to live inside rooms that had once been used to dress my weakness for an audience. The new place was smaller, uglier, and better. A kitchen that opened badly into the living room. A back deck with a cracked board Danny swore he would fix and then never did because he claimed the crack gave the house character. No grand foyer, no staged den, no marble staircase fit for dramatic pauses, just light, wood, noise, and a layout that discouraged secretive elegance. The first night there, Nora stood in the middle of the living room surrounded by boxes and said, "It doesn't feel like a place where people could run a coup." That was the best review the house ever got. She left for college a year and change later. Not far, far enough. Close enough for dinner if traffic behaved. When I helped move her into the dorm, she made me promise not to turn every goodbye into philosophy. So I did not. I carried boxes, hung string lights badly, pretended not to notice when she rearranged the cheap furniture into the only sane pattern in the room within 14 minutes of arrival. As I was leaving, she hugged me and said, "You know I don't need you to be made of stone, right?" I looked at her. "Do I usually act like I don't know that?" "Yes," she said, constantly. She was not wrong. Driving home from campus that evening, I thought about the first weeks after the hospital, how carefully I had controlled everything. My face, my voice, my breathing, the sequence of legal responses, the timing of calls, the choice to let Celeste and Gavin think weakness had simplified me. Control saved us. That is true, but control also leaves residue. You can become too good at living one emotional floor lower than where the real fire is. So I started doing the least dramatic, brave things I could manage. Therapy. Actual therapy. Not because I had a breakdown. Because I was tired of being impressive in rooms where no one was trying to kill me with vocabulary anymore. I told the therapist in our first session that I did not really believe in talking for its own sake. She said, "Good, then we can talk for a reason." I stayed. I learned small, unpleasant truths, that I still scan people's language for coercive framing within 30 seconds of any complicated conversation. That I react badly to the word continuity when used outside business. That concern offered too smoothly makes my shoulders tighten before my mind catches up. That part of me still sometimes assumes love is safest when it asks nothing at all, because asking can become leverage in the wrong hands. Those truths did not make me tragic. They made me specific. Specific is manageable. Vagueness is where ghosts breed. About 2 years after the board fight, Celeste wrote once more. Not to reconcile, not to renegotiate, just a letter from whatever quieter version of consequences she now occupied. She said she had stopped trying to tell herself the story where pressure explained everything. She said she had finally understood that each soft phrase she used during those weeks had not made the plan gentler. It had made it more efficient. She said she did not expect forgiveness, only accuracy. I appreciated the last word, accuracy. Late, but accurate. I did not write back, not out of cruelty, because some letters are complete once read. Anything added after that is appetite pretending to be closure. Gavin I saw once by accident at a trade luncheon 3 years on. He looked older in the jaw, smaller in the confidence. The kind of man who now introduces himself with context because his old last name no longer does the work he hoped it would. He nodded. I nodded back. No scene, no bitterness hot enough to bother with. Just recognition. 2 men who shared blood and then a case history. Some endings do not need language. They need distance that remains distance. Mercer Build Group kept going. Different shape, cleaner controls, less family mythology, more good boring governance. We stopped pretending loyalty was a substitute for systems. That lesson cost too much not to keep. The boardroom changed too. For a while I kept the same chair. Then one day I moved to the opposite end of the table. Not because power demanded it, because memory did. I wanted to see the room from the angle where no one had once imagined I could be replaced while still warming the seat. That small change mattered more than I expected. People still ask sometimes whether I hate them. I usually say no because hate sounds too active for what remains. The truer answer is harder to phrase. I hate certain methods. The counterfeit softness, the conversion of concern into leverage, the way people can weaponize a child through grammar before they ever touch the law. But individuals age, consequences age them faster. Eventually what remains is not hate. It is clarity without appetite. If I had to name the real revenge now, years later, I would put it this way. I did not let their interpretation of my weakness become public fact. I did not let my daughter grow up inside their edited version of me. I did not let a company built by 3 generations become a stage for family opportunists fluent in temporary language. I did not let my own near death become their administrative beginning. That is revenge in the form I respect. Not noise, not humiliation for its own sake, restoration of authorship. And there is one last image, smaller than the boardroom, smaller than the courthouse, smaller even than the first terrible question outside the hospital room, that returns to me more than any other. A Sunday morning. New house, windows open, rain not quite starting. Nora home from college for the weekend, and half asleep at the kitchen island eating cereal straight from the box, because adulthood has made all of us indecorous in ways I now consider holy. Danny outside on the deck swearing at the cracked board he still had not fixed. Coffee too strong, phone face down, no staged concern, no hidden notebook, no one waiting for me to forget myself in public, no one calibrating the room against my supposed decline. Just a life. I was rinsing a mug when Nora looked up and said, "You know what the weirdest part is?" "What?" "You're calmer now than when everything looked better." I thought about that before answering. Then said the truest thing I had. Things only looked better because I didn't know what I was standing in. She nodded. went back to her cereal, and that was enough. I died for 92 seconds on a Friday morning. They thought the story would begin there for them. That my collapse was the event that opened the future they wanted. What they failed to understand is that some men become easier to move when they nearly die, and some men become impossible. I became impossible in the exact way they deserved. Quiet, patient, difficult to counterfeit, impossible to narrate for profit. And once I understood that, once I saw the architecture clearly, once I stopped asking love to defend itself and started asking evidence to do the work, the ending belonged to me again. That is the thing I would tell any man sitting in a hospital bed, hearing soft voices outside the door, and wondering whether concern and strategy have started sounding too similar. Trust the cold feeling. Trust sequence. Trust the words people choose when they think your body has removed you from authorship. And if they have already begun rehearsing your exit in your own house, your own company, your own child's hearing, do not give them the gift of a loud mistake. Get quiet, get exact, and make sure the last version of the story is the one with your name still in it, because you chose to keep speaking. Before all of that, before the hospital, before the shell vendors, before the river lunch and the boardroom, and the phrase household narrative stability entered my vocabulary like a poison with a diploma, there was a marriage. Not a myth, not an album. A marriage. Real enough to deserve remembering accurately, even after it became useful to lawyers. Celeste and I met at a permitting hearing in Baltimore when we were both too young to dress as expensive as we were trying to look. I was there because the company needed a variance, and my father still believed the son who could handle inspectors would eventually handle everything else. Celeste was there because the architecture firm she worked for had sent the youngest associate least likely to insult a public official. She wore a navy blazer, carried 3 color-tabbed folders, and spoke into a microphone with the clear, measured confidence of someone who had spent her entire life learning how to make male impatience wait one more minute. After the hearing, the city clerk made some joke about concrete men and drawing women needing separate exits for public safety. Celeste rolled her eyes. I laughed. Then we ended up in line at the same coffee cart outside because apparently even in civic bureaucracy, the laws of bad timing remain romantic to somebody. She asked what Mercer Build Group actually built. I said garages, schools, ugly but necessary pieces of a city's spine. She said that was a better answer than most men gave because most men tried to turn utility into grandeur the second a woman looked interested. I told her grandeur was expensive and usually leaked. She laughed at that. That laugh mattered. Not because it was musical or cinematic, because it was honest and a little relieved. The laugh of a woman tired of being courted by men auditioning instead of speaking. For the first 3 years, we were good in the ordinary hard-working way. We rented a narrow row house with pipes that clanged at night, and a landlord who believed peeling paint counted as historical character. We ate late, worked too much, shared one car for 8 months, argued over cabinets, taxes, and whose family was more quietly manipulative at Christmas. We were not glamorous. We were alive in the same direction. That matters more. When Nora was born, Mercer Build Group was still small enough that my anxiety had a personal smell. Wet wood, diesel, printer toner, bid deadlines. I slept with numbers in my teeth. Celeste went back to work sooner than either of us had planned, because her firm promoted only those women who returned before everyone had finished congratulating them. That sentence sounds cruel, too. It is also true. We became one of those couples who confused endurance with teamwork. Bills paid, child safe, schedules coordinated, food in the fridge, work progressing, no one cheating, no one screaming, no one visibly leaving. That can look very healthy from outside. Sometimes it is simply disciplined loneliness. I was not absent in the cartoon villain way. No mistress, no secret apartments, no whiskey on the breath at 2 a.m. I was absent in the respectable male way, phone face down but never really off. Dinner interrupted by site photos, vacations chosen by where I could still reach the office quickly if a subcontractor combusted, praise offered through provision, love translated into infrastructure. Celeste was not blameless even then. She liked image more than I admitted. She enjoyed rooms that confirmed rank. She liked the way donors and consultants and wives of public officials leaned in harder when she spoke. She noticed pedigree and polish in people faster than I noticed either. But early on, those traits looked like polish, not appetite. Again, hindsight is a bully. There were warnings, plenty. 1 year on our anniversary, I took a client call between the appetizers and the main course because an excavation phase had hit an underground line nobody had mapped properly, and I was convinced catastrophe respected romance less than I did. When I came back to the table 23 minutes later, Celeste was staring out the restaurant window and had already paid the bill. In the car, she said, very quietly, "You keep treating our life like it's what happens in the hallway between real work." I apologized, I meant it. Then the next bid cycle arrived, and I turned apology into the kind of temporary improvement that lets smart women begin mislabeling exhaustion as hope. Another time, years later, she said she felt like the company sat at the table with us more often than I did. I told her the company paid for the table. That answer should have shamed me instantly. It did not. Men become stupid exactly where utility overlaps with ego. We start calling sacrifice by its public name and refusing its private cost. I tell you this because accuracy matters, not to reduce Celeste's guilt, to avoid the false comfort of turning myself into a saint merely because she later became a strategist with no conscience. I was difficult to live with in ways that did not deserve what followed and yet still existed. That is the adult shape of the truth. Gavin entered that marriage slowly, not sexually at first, atmospherically. He knew our rhythms. He knew when I was overloaded. He knew Celeste's tastes because family dinners and company functions and charity boards all blur into one long corridor if you let them. He arrived with easy admiration, useful availability, and the one trait lonely marriages should always fear most in outsiders: timing. He would notice when Celeste's glass was empty before I did. He would ask about her projects by name. He would remember details from conversations I missed because I was replying to site managers with one eye still on the room. None of that is betrayal on its own. But attention becomes dangerous when it enters a house already learning the wrong silences. I remember one party at our place for a school foundation fundraiser. Nora was 12. The company had just closed a municipal package big enough that people started congratulating me as if I had cured a disease rather than successfully shepherded concrete and steel through a bidding process. I was trapped in the kitchen with 2 bond advisors and a councilman who spoke only in pending favors. When I finally looked up, I saw Celeste and Gavin in the dining room near the floral arrangement she hated and still pretended to appreciate. They were laughing. Not flirtatiously in any obvious way, just easily, like they were standing in a room where I was no longer the assumed axis. The image passed, then stayed, then passed again. That is how many early warnings work. They do not stab, they tap. You have to choose whether to call the tap by its right name. I did not choose. I returned to the councilman, to the kitchen, to being useful. Later, once everything broke, I found an old text thread between Celeste and a friend of hers from those years. Mostly ordinary. School forms, paint choices, Nora's impossible science teacher. Then one message from the night of that fundraiser. Sometimes the wrong man notices you in the right ways, and the right man notices you only when the room empties. That line is too neat not to have been rehearsed in her head long before she typed it. And yes, it cut. Not because it justified anything. Because there was truth enough in it to make me ashamed of how long I had been speaking love through invoices. Again, none of this excuses the plot that followed. But a script that pretends marriages decay only when one person turns cartoon evil is a stupid script. Real collapse has layers: neglect, vanity, ambition, resentment, timing. Then, if conscience truly fails, strategy. I think Celeste crossed the real internal line not when she first kissed Gavin or first imagined leaving. I think she crossed it the first time she realized she could keep the architecture of my life while removing me from authorship. That is more intoxicating than adultery for certain people. Not passion, design. To keep the house, the name, the company silhouette, the daughter's social continuity, the board's comfort, the donor's assumptions, the neighborhood's respectability, and simply alter which man occupies the center once the paperwork catches up. That was her fantasy, not escape, replacement without visible demolition. And if I am being especially honest, I can see why that fantasy appealed to her. Explosive endings are embarrassing. They spill. They reduce status. They make friends choose tables. Clean transitions preserve image. They let the guilty keep aesthetic control. What better vehicle than a husband who almost died and came back tired enough for people to accept soft language about stepping back? That was the architecture. Gavin gave it nerve. The consultants gave it paper. My collapse gave it speed. But the hunger underneath it had older roots. In my work. In her vanity. In our practiced endurance. In all the ways a family can remain functional long after intimacy has been replaced by role performance. Why tell you this? Because I refuse to let the longer story become simple just because the betrayal later got criminally organized. I was not blindsided by paradise turning into hell overnight. I was a busy man in a respectable failing marriage who mistook productivity for devotion until 2 opportunists translated that failure into a governance plan. That is uglier, more adult, and more useful to admit. Because if you do not admit the earlier cracks, you learn nothing except how to feel pure after surviving a dirtier person than you. Purity is a cheap lesson. Pattern is the expensive one. There was also my father. You cannot understand Gavin fully without understanding the house we were made in. Our father, Thomas Mercer I, was not a cruel man in the sensational sense. No fists, no secret second life, no whiskey rage-breaking lamps in the den. He was simply one of those men who handed approval out in job site units. Usefulness, stamina, competence under pressure. If he loved you through tasks. If he was proud, he turned it into more responsibility before you had finished sweating through the first batch. I was older and steadier. That made me easier for him to trust with real things earlier. Keys, Deliveries, client exposure, the harder jobs, the jobs where a mistake would actually cost money. Gavin got jokes, errands, smaller chances. And what do younger brothers often learn from that arrangement if no one intervenes properly? Not merely resentment, interpretation. They begin translating every earned difference into favoritism because favoritism hurts less than inadequacy. I saw it even when we were boys. If I got praised for keeping the lumber count right, Gavin would disappear for an hour and come back with some complicated explanation for why he had not been given a count worth succeeding at. If I made the team and he did not, the coach clearly preferred quiet kids. If I got trusted with the truck at 16, it was because Dad had already decided what son mattered. These stories were not always fully false, but they were always generous to Gavin in exactly the way that let him postpone responsibility for his own weaker muscles. Our mother tried to soften it. She was warmer than Dad, smarter about ego. She used to tell Gavin that comparison is how insecure men outsource their identity. He would nod and then spend the next week comparing anyway. Some people hear truth and treat it as texture, not instruction. When the company really started growing, Dad did what many founders do when they do not understand how much damage legacy language can do. He talked about me as continuity, about Gavin as potential if he ever settled. Potential if he ever settled. That phrase should be carved over half the failures between brothers and family businesses. It sounds hopeful. In practice, it trains the younger one to imagine there is a throne being withheld by unfair chemistry instead of a discipline gap requiring his own labor. I tried for years to bridge it. I brought Gavin in on bids he had not earned because I thought responsibility might mature him faster if it arrived early. Sometimes it did. He could be excellent in bursts, charming with city partners, quick with donor boards, savvy in rooms where I was too blunt. That was real. But bursts are dangerous in family businesses. Bursts let weak men collect identity from the idea of their brilliance while sturdier people keep carrying the continuous weight. Dad retired formally, but never truly stopped hovering. He would come by the office and ask whether Gavin had finally learned to finish what he started. He meant it privately. He thought it was harmless family language. He did not understand that words like finally become acid if they drip over enough years. When Dad died, Gavin cried harder than I did. Not because he loved him more, because unfinished sons always cry hardest at funerals. The dead closed the only door still holding their hoped-for acquittal. After the funeral, Gavin asked whether I thought Dad respected him. I answered too quickly. I said yes, because grief seemed like the wrong moment for structural honesty. What I should have said was this: I think Dad respected the version of you that appeared briefly under pressure and then kept asking the world to remember it after you stopped doing the work. But I did not say that. I chose comfort. Again, that male reflex. Delay the truth. Keep the room smooth. Call it mercy. Pay later. Looking back, I think Dad's shadow sat in the middle of the later betrayal more than either of us admitted. Not as cause, as fuel. Gavin did not merely want my company authority or my wife or the life shape attached to my name. He wanted posthumous correction. He wanted a story where the older son turned out overbearing, emotionally unavailable, too rigid, too dominant, too central. A story where the younger son's opportunism could be repackaged as finally stepping into his rightful maturity. That fantasy is catnip to men who mistake grievance for biography. During mediation, one of the ugliest moments was not with Celeste. It was when Gavin said, "You always got to be the dependable Mercer." Dependable Mercer. The phrase sounded ridiculous on paper. In the room, it carried 40 years of sediment. "You think that was a gift?" I asked him. "You think being the dependable one feels like power all the time? It feels like gravity, Gavin. It feels like everyone else getting to be unfinished, while you turn your own fear into structure, because no one else in the room will." He looked genuinely shocked, not convinced. Shocked, as if the burden of competence had simply never occurred to him as a burden because he had spent his entire life coveting the authority without pricing the weight. That is what made him so dangerous once Celeste gave his resentment a cleaner costume. He did not feel like a thief. He felt like a delayed correction, and delayed corrections make the best liars because they tell themselves the theft is merely history catching up. There was a memory that kept returning to me while the case moved through its phases. I was 22, Gavin 18. Dad had sent us to deliver material to a school renovation outside Towson. Rain all morning, mud up to the ankles. The foreman short 2 men because one had gone to jail, and the other had apparently run off with a waitress or a welding torch. Gavin hated the whole thing. Hated the mud, hated the foreman, hated that I knew what to do before anyone explained it. At one point, he threw his gloves into the truck bed and said, "Why do you always know how to stand in these places?" Dad answered before I could. "Because he shows up before he speaks." At the time, I thought that was one of those throwaway worksite lessons older men produce instead of affection. Later, I understood it better. Show up before you speak. That is all stewardship really is. Arrive, carry, observe, then claim language, not the other way around. Gavin spent his adult life reversing that order. He spoke first, positioned first, explained first, branded first. Then, if pressured, sometimes showed up just long enough to keep the story from collapsing. That works socially for years. It fails under audit. I sometimes wonder whether things would have changed if Dad had been softer or clearer, or if I had told Gavin earlier and more brutally that charm cannot replace endurance in a business where weather and payroll and subcontractor failure all still arrive on Fridays. Maybe, maybe not. Adult men are not children waiting to be fully explained by their fathers. At some point, the story belongs to your own choices. That is another boundary I had to learn after the hospital. Understanding a man is not the same as carrying him. When Gavin finally lost the company titles, the Annapolis fantasy, the chance to remain visually adjacent to my life, and the explanatory language he had built around himself, what remained was not a villain in the operatic sense. Just a middle-aged man with a grievance habit and no more structures left sturdy enough to hide it. That was sad. It was also earned. I tell you all this because Brother Betrayal reads cheaply when you flatten it. He wanted my life. He took my wife. He stole the company, yes. And also, he was a second son fed on comparison, warmed by partial talent, over-rewarded for social ease, undertrained in endurance, and ready at last when my body gave him the one opening resentment had always promised would come. That complexity does not absolve him. It only makes the story human enough to be useful. The world is full of Gavins, men who think the dependable person in the room is loved more rather than leaned on harder, men who wait for the competent one to tire and then call the hand off destiny, men who believe history owes them a correction and that any tool, marriage, illness, grief, paperwork, a child's confusion, is acceptable if it gets them closer to the seat they have been narrating themselves into for 20 years. I no longer carry him. That might be the healthiest sentence in the whole file. There were months after the settlements when the story stopped being about them and became, against my wishes, about what kind of man I wanted to be if I was no longer mainly reacting. This is harder than revenge. Reaction gives shape. It gives mourning purpose. Call the lawyer, review the filing, check the timeline, protect the child, answer the board, trace the money. There is clarity in emergency. Then one day the emergency recedes and you discover the rest of your life standing there in the doorway asking what happens now that there is no fire left to organize you. The first sign of that came on a Tuesday in February. No major hearing, no surprise email, no call from Lena, no board drama, just a normal workday. 2 site updates. A lunch I forgot to eat, rain turning to sleet. At 6:20, I was still in the office staring at a wall schedule when Danny knocked on the doorframe and said, "You know everybody else left 40 minutes ago, right?" I looked around. Empty floor, dark reception, reflection in the glass making me look like a man still auditioning for the version of himself who had survived on being indispensable. When I got home, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Nora at a friend's. No active filings open on the kitchen island. No urgent call. Nothing to solve. I stood in the living room and realized I had no idea what a free evening was supposed to feel like when it was not being used to manage collapse. That is not a noble realization. It is embarrassing, but it is real. Many men build themselves around functions so completely that once betrayal removes the emergency, they discover emptiness where interior life should have been. So I started forcing ordinary things, cooking properly instead of assembling edible logistics, reading fiction again, not business books, actual novels with human mess in them, Sundays without the office, walking the harbor in weather too cold for sane people because movement was easier than sitting still inside rooms no longer under siege. At first it all felt counterfeit, like recovery cosplay. Then, slowly, less so. I joined a small Thursday dinner group May bullied me into attending. Her phrase, not mine. 3 widowers, 1 retired judge, a woman who ran a nonprofit theater and insulted everyone equally on principle. No networking, no spouses, no pitches, just food, stories, bad opinions, and the occasional political argument aborted before dessert. The first few dinners I listened more than I spoke. By the 5th, I heard myself laughing at something stupid about over-engineered salad tongues and realized laughter had entered without asking permission from the legal calendar. That mattered. So did friendship with men who knew nothing about Mercer Build Group and did not care. One of them, Samir, owned a marine supply business and had never once mistaken my reluctance to talk about the case for stoicism. He called it what it was. Habit. One night, 2 bourbons in, he said, "You realize competence is the drug men like us use to avoid feeling owned by our own lives." I wanted to argue, could not. That was irritating and therefore useful. I also started noticing how often people praised me in ways that were not actually compliments. Steady, solid, reliable, tough. These sound good. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they are cages with nice fonts. They tell a man what people need him to keep being even after the structure that produced the need has changed. Therapy helped there too. Not with wisdom, with irritation. My therapist, Mara, had a habit of asking questions that turned respectable self-descriptions into evidence exhibits. You say you're steady. For whom? You say you're strong. At what emotional cost? You say you're over it. What behaviors still say otherwise? You say the company survived. Did you? That last one bothered me for a week. Did you? I did, mostly. But the answer was not the clean yes I would have offered at a board dinner. I survived in fragments first. Authority intact, trust altered, pride bruised in useful places, tenderness still under construction. Dating, for example, was impossible for a long time and then absurd. People asked eventually, May 1st, then Samir, then even Nora, who approached the subject as if she were discussing a controlled demolition plan and did not want me to trigger any wires by accident. I tried once, a coffee with a woman introduced through the Thursday group. Smart, funny, divorced, kind eyes, zero chance. Not because of her, because halfway through she asked whether I missed being married, and I found myself answering like a witness on cross-examination. Careful, categorical, more interested in precision than connection. I drove home afterward and laughed alone in the car because at least I finally understood the problem. It was not that I no longer believed in love. It was that I no longer trusted unexamined softness. And romance in its early form is made almost entirely of unexamined softness. Tone, assumption, projection, interpretive generosity. I had seen too clearly how those things can be exploited if hunger and self-justification enter a room together. Mara told me not to moralize my caution. She said caution after betrayal is normal. The work is deciding whether caution remains a filter or becomes a religion. That sentence helped. A filter, not a religion. Nora changed fastest after she left for college. Distance suited her, not because she wanted escape from me, because she needed a landscape where every room had not once been part of an internal legal map. She came home sharper, lighter, less vigilant around corners, still watchful. That may always be in her, but watchful in the ordinary young woman way now. Not the child archivist way. The first Thanksgiving after she left, she brought 2 friends home because one had a family too chaotic and one had no realistic airfare budget. The house filled, badly timed oven logistics, laughter from the wrong room, music too loud, shoes everywhere. I stood in the kitchen surrounded by noise and thought this is what a house should feel like when nobody is using private language as leverage. At some point during dishes, one of Nora's friends said, "Your dad has calm energy." Nora snorted and said, "That's because you missed the years where his nervous system was a corporation." I nearly dropped a plate laughing. That too is healing, when the old damage becomes speakable without becoming the room's god. I kept the company, but changed the culture around me. No more family shortcuts, no more informal signatory trust, no more vague continuity language and internal policy. Every governance meeting now begins with a stupid little rule printed at the top of the agenda because I wanted the stupidity visible. Concern is not control. It embarrassed people at first. Good. Embarrassment is how important rules get remembered. We also built an emergency incapacity protocol so over clear it could not be hijacked by domestic narrative again. Independent physician, independent board chair, 2-factor signatory protection, documented evidence chain, no spouse or relative as sole channel for competence concerns. When I presented it, one director said, "This feels very specific." I said, "That's because I paid for the education." The room laughed, then stopped laughing when it realized I had not really been joking. If you ask what the long tail of revenge feels like, this is the part nobody writes attractively. It feels administrative. Habits changed, controls added, doors left open, language corrected, triggers identified, recipes learned, texts answered slower, love no longer trusted at face value but not exiled either. It feels like putting your own name back into daily life, one repetitive act at a time until the grand betrayal has no choice but to shrink to its actual size. Enormous in memory, finite in governance. Some evenings I still think of the hospital room, the machine beside me. The voices outside asking how quickly a man with short-term memory problems could be declared unfit to run his own company. Not because I am stuck, because origin scenes leave residue. They become private measuring sticks. Whenever life starts getting too smooth, too curated, too full of soft language doing hard work, I hear that sentence again and remember the cost of not challenging tone quickly enough. That memory no longer destroys the day. It sharpens it. Which is different. Destruction is appetite. Sharpening is utility. Maybe that is the real version of peace available to people like me. Not forgetting, using memory without letting it own the schedule. I can live with that. More importantly, I can live from it. If this story needs one final truth, it is about silence. Silence saved me. Silence nearly killed me. Both are true. For years, silence was how I carried strain. Do not burden the room. Do not dramatize fatigue. Do not ask if the marriage is lonely if payroll still clears. Do not tell your daughter you are scared when the company is shaky. Do not ask your wife whether admiration has turned into contempt if the house still looks like a house and the holidays still arrive on time. That version of silence is cowardice dressed as steadiness. I know because I wore it professionally. Then after the hospital, I learned the opposite use. Strategic silence. Let them speak. Let them teach. Let the room reveal appetite. Let the liar hear his own confidence before he hears your correction. That silence is not cowardice, it is a blade. The difference between those two silences took me years to understand. One avoids truth, because truth might reorder your life before you feel ready. The other withholds your hand until the other person has fully shown theirs. One is fear, the other is timing. This matters because men in families like mine are taught silence badly. Be strong, be solid, do not overreact, do not embarrass anyone, do not turn domestic discomfort into public disruption. Those lessons make us reliable in storms and stupid in betrayals. They teach us to prize the visual survival of the structure above the ethical survival of the people inside it. I think now about the younger version of myself, a lot less kindly and a lot more usefully. The man at the anniversary dinner taking the call. The man answering Celeste that the company paid for the table. The man who found the first uneasy image of her laughing with Gavin and filed it under weather, because weather requires nothing from you except patience. The man who heard Nora's worry tones years later and still told himself intelligent children often sound older than they should without asking who made her sound that way. He was not a villain. He was not even uniquely foolish. He was simply a man whose strengths had become efficient hiding places for his weakness. There is no honor in refusing to say that now, and no danger in saying it either. The danger was leaving it unexamined. Unexamined strength becomes habitat for future predators. One spring morning, several years after everything, I spoke at a trade conference about governance in family-held firms. That sentence makes me sound like I became one of those men who turn every scar into a PowerPoint. I did not. I hate PowerPoint. But I agreed because too many rooms like mine still assume loyalty is internal control and family concern is above review. It is not. Not if you want to keep both family and company alive. I told them 3 things. First, never let love substitute for verification where authority is concerned. Second, if a spouse or sibling begins converting private observations into governance categories, slow everything down and bring in outsiders before the language hardens. Third, children in these situations are not context. They are not atmospheric proof. They are not supporting material. The moment a family begins positioning a child as corroboration, you no longer have a domestic misunderstanding. You have contamination. The room was very quiet by the end. Not because I was inspirational, because I was exact. Exactness frightens rooms built on mythology. After the talk, a man about my age waited until most people had left and then asked if I thought a family business can survive once relatives start narrating each other strategically. I told him yes, a family might not. The business might, sometimes both, but only if somebody is willing to kill the sentimental language before it kills the truth. He thanked me, then said, "My wife has started using the phrase executive concern when she talks about my brother." I looked at him and said, "Then go home and ask better questions tonight." That is the only public service I claim from any of this. Not wisdom, just translation. I know how these words sound when they first enter a room. I know how harmless they pretend to be. I know what grows behind them if no one forces sequence into the light. Nora once asked whether I thought she would ever trust marriage. We were walking near the harbor after dinner. Wind ugly, seagulls criminal. The kind of evening cities only call charming if they need tourism. I answered slowly because the wrong answer there can become a prophecy. "Yes," I said, "but probably not the version people perform first." She smiled a little. "That sounds expensive." "It is." I put my hands in my coat pockets and looked out at the water. "But all the cheap versions cost more later." That line pleased her. I could tell. Not because it was beautiful, because it was practical. She has always preferred truth that can survive being used. And maybe that is the final gift the whole disaster left us. Practical truth. Not pretty. Not soothing. Usable. Useful truth looks like this. A woman can really suffer in a marriage and still choose evil solutions. A brother can carry old injuries and still become responsible for what he does with them. A child can tell the truth without being made responsible for adult redemption. A company can survive scandal if it learns to prefer systems over mythology. A man can nearly die, be used as transition material, and still refuse the version of weakness other people drafted for him. I know how these stories usually end online, with slogans, with triumphant loneliness dressed as masculine evolution, with declarations that trust no one, and love is a trap, and family is a scam, and ambition is the only faithful spouse. That is adolescent nonsense wearing a grown man's jacket. Here's the real ending. I still love people, carefully. I still run a company, differently. I still miss the marriage that might have existed if 2 people had been braver earlier and 1 woman had been less vain later. I still believe family can mean something, just not automatically. I still believe in tenderness. I simply no longer believe tenderness should arrive unexamined where power, money, illness, and children are involved. That is not cynicism. That is stewardship. Some mornings I still wake before sunrise and sit in the kitchen with coffee too hot and the house not yet fully itself. On those mornings, before the day puts on its practical clothes, memory sometimes brings me back to the ICU, the machine, the antiseptic, the voice outside the door asking how quickly a man might be declared unfit. I let the memory arrive, then I let it leave. That is another skill recovery teaches if you stay with it long enough. How to let old danger visit without offering it a room. Then I stand up, open the blinds, check the weather, answer the messages that actually matter, and continue. That is not flashy. Good. Flashy endings are for people who still need witnesses more than peace. I died for 92 seconds on a Friday morning. They thought that gave them a head start. Instead, it gave me the cleanest education of my life. I learned what soft betrayal sounds like before it reaches the legal phase. I learned what kinds of men call themselves practical while feeding on another man's temporary weakness. I learned that a child's trust is the first territory predators try to edit when they want the rest of the map. I learned that revenge worth respecting is almost always administrative before it is emotional. Freeze the right account. Preserve the right message. Protect the right witness. Make the guilty speak just long enough, then remove the ground they were counting on. And I learned one last thing that matters more than any of the rest. A man does not recover by proving the people who wronged him were terrible. He recovers by refusing to keep living in the grammar they built for him. That is why I keep telling the story this way. Not louder, clearer, so nobody mistakes concern for control again. So no daughter has to hear herself described as corroboration. So no brother gets to hide 40 years of grievance inside one soft phrase about continuity. So no wife who has already chosen appetite gets to call architecture love. If there is dignity in what happened next, it lives there, in clear language, in restored authorship, in a life no longer written from the hallway by people waiting for your body to stay still long enough to become convenient. That is the ending, and this time it stays where I put it. There are also the people around the edges, the ones stories usually flatten into furniture. Receptionists, bookkeepers, project managers, neighbors, the adults who are not central enough to own the plot and yet still feel the temperature change before the fire alarm goes off. Our controller, Janine, knew something was wrong with Gavin before I did. Not the affair, not the house, not the board move, something simpler and therefore more important. He had started asking questions no one with good intentions asks in clusters. How quickly can payroll authority be reassigned if a signer is medically unavailable? What is the notification sequence if a president is under sedation? Can a spouse request copies of personal draw histories if the executive is resting? Questions like that do not belong together unless somebody is sketching a map. Janine told me later she had answered him narrowly on purpose, not because she understood the whole shape, because accounting women with 20 years in the field develop a survival smell finer than most legal departments. She said the phrase under sedation did it. That's not a concern phrase, she told me. That's a permissions phrase. I wrote that down too. Permissions phrase. There are whole categories of dangerous language that become visible only after you survive them once. Danny, on the operations side, saw a different piece. He noticed Gavin suddenly taking interest in site-level updates he had never had patience for before. Not to help, to rehearse. Bad actors always overlearn late. They ask for the wrong kinds of detail at the wrong times because they need to sound ready faster than competence can actually be built. One Thursday, 2 weeks before the hospital, Danny was walking Gavin through a school package delay, and Gavin interrupted to ask what field superintendents would need to hear first if Adrian stepped out unexpectedly for health reasons. Danny told him that phrasing stuck in his teeth all day. He did not report it because men in construction are trained to ignore bad intuition if the speaker is related to ownership. That is another cultural weakness. We call it respect. Often, it is just cowardice around hierarchy. The neighbor across the street, Mrs. Talbot, noticed things too. She was 70 if she was a day, still dressed for the grocery store like she might unexpectedly need to testify before Congress, and watched our block through lace curtains with the vigilance of a retired intelligence service. Normally, I would have considered that irritating. After the collapse, it became data. She told Nora one afternoon, entirely unprompted, and with the brutal innocence only old women and children can carry off, that Uncle Gavin had been arriving late too often for a man only helping with family stress. Nora repeated it to me with a face somewhere between scandalized and impressed. When I later asked Mrs. Talbot whether she really meant late, she gave me the look older women reserve for men who ask questions after the useful window. "Honey," she said, "I know the difference between a support visit and a secret." That sentence did not make it into any filing. It stayed with me anyway. Support visit and secret. If all of society's useful women ever got into one room and standardized their vocabulary, half the liars in the country would lose oxygen overnight. There was also Leila Perez, the ICU nurse. She checked on me once after I was moved out of intensive care because, as she put it, I like following plots I have already invested in. I told her enough to make her eyebrows rise and her professional restraint twitch. Then she said something that became one of my practical rules going forward. "Never let the person narrating your weakness be the same person who benefits from it," she said. Medical staff understand that instantly because they see family systems distort under illness every week. Healthy people, especially men, like to pretend love disinfects interest. It does not. Sometimes interest puts on love because the room trusts love on sight. One of the board members, Richard Boone, became useful in a way that embarrassed him. Richard had always liked Gavin because Gavin made him feel shrewd, current, socially interesting. That sort of man attracts older directors who have begun confusing their need to feel relevant with their talent for reading character. Once the Monday meeting collapsed and the documents started walking, Richard called me privately and admitted that Gavin had been preparing him emotionally for a continuity vote. Not with facts, with posture. You know Adrian hates slowing down. You know Celeste is under strain. You know Nora is worried. You know the company cannot look uncertain in front of lenders. Again, not lies in the pure sense. Fragments arranged toward a destination. Richard looked almost ill as he recited them. Men of his generation do not enjoy discovering they were cultivated by someone they had congratulated for maturity. "Did you believe him?" I asked. He sat in silence long enough that I almost spared him the answer. Then he said, "I believed the emotional shape of what he was saying." He looked up. "That's worse, isn't it?" Yes, it was worse. Facts can be disproved. Emotional shapes are how bad actors travel through rooms without ever fully lying. I sometimes think about how many people in the periphery could have shifted things sooner if our culture taught them to respect intuition as much as hierarchy. Janine, Danny, Mrs. Talbot, even Richard in his compromised usefulness. All of them had a piece. All of them felt friction. None of them had a sanctioned language to escalate it before the system hardened. We train people to distrust themselves around family business because loyalty sounds cleaner than alarm. That is how rot buys time. After the dust settled, I did something that seemed small to everybody except the people who mattered. I changed the company policy on concern reporting. Not glamorous, not headline-worthy, but specific. If anyone connected to leadership, related or not, asks pattern questions about authority transfer, health-based signatory changes, domestic access to governance documents, or continuity triggers without formal process, the question itself must be logged. No shame, no accusation, just a log, friction recorded, because predators depend on unlogged atmosphere. Janine cried when she read that policy draft. Actual tears. I asked why. She said, "Because if that had existed 6 months earlier, I would have written everything down and slept better." That was enough for me. Sometimes the right revenge is giving the next room language you were denied in your own. The same logic reached home too. Nora and I started a ridiculous practice we never admitted to anyone else. Whenever either of us heard adult language that felt wrong, too soft for the harm it was carrying, we would name it at dinner. No lectures, just identification. Cover phrase, permission phrase, mood laundering, complexity shield, concern inflation. It began as dark humor, then became one of the most useful repair tools in the house. We were teaching ourselves not to be colonized by tone again. One evening, Nora said, "Mom used a complexity shield 3 times in one voicemail." I said that's because she majored in architecture and minor villains love structure. Nora laughed so hard she snorted water onto the table. For 10 seconds, the whole case lost oxygen. That mattered. You have to steal back ordinary laughter wherever you can. Predators always try to make the room feel too sacred for laughter because laughter reclassifies them as smaller than the mythology they built. Even the contractor world, crude and practical as it is, reacted in revealing ways once pieces of the truth circulated quietly. A drywall supplier I had known for 18 years shook my hand at a site visit and said, "Heard there was family trouble. Glad you kept paper." That was his whole philosophy. Paper. In construction, men trust paper more than declarations because paper survives moods. Perhaps families should learn from that earlier. Another superintendent told Danny, not knowing it would get back to me, "Mercer got meaner." Danny corrected him. "No, cleaner." I like that. Not because I enjoyed being considered harder, because it was accurate. Meaner implies appetite. Cleaner implies filtration. That was the actual change after the hospital. I stopped wasting moral energy on people who had already converted mine into infrastructure. When I look back now, the edge people are part of why the story feels complete instead of merely survived. Not because they solved it, because they proved something broader. Systems do not break only at the center. They announce themselves in small frictions everywhere first. The woman in accounting who hears the wrong question. The nurse who notices benefit attaching itself to weakness too quickly. The old neighbor who knows support from secret. The operations man who hears a health scenario framed like a transition exercise. If you ignore all those people, you deserve the grand betrayal when it finally arrives. Not morally, practically. The warning system was already lit. You just thought centrality exempted you from listening sideways. I did not make that mistake again. If you want the cleanest picture of closure, it came years later in a place that had nothing to do with hospitals, lawyers, boardrooms, shell vendors, or waterfront fantasies. It came at Nora's graduation, not the ceremony itself. Those things are always too large, too loud, too administratively sentimental to hold real truth without crushing it under badly amplified speeches. It came afterward. Late afternoon, campus mostly emptied out, families taking photographs under flowering trees they had not personally earned but were still using as emotional scenery. Nora barefoot in the grass because the shoes had stopped being negotiable 2 hours earlier. Her friends somewhere behind us shouting about dinner. My suit jacket over one shoulder. Sun too bright. Everything looking like one of those endings movies fake badly. Celeste was there. At Nora's request, with boundaries. No performance, no private side rooms, no historical revision dressed as maternal depth, just attendance, distance. Pictures if invited, leave when the graduate says she is done. Those were Nora's terms. I admired them enough to stay quiet. Gavin was not there. Not because I banned him, because Nora did. That too mattered. Adults who weaponize children often forget that children eventually grow into boundary-setting human beings with long memories and no need to preserve anyone's preferred symmetry. We took the standard photographs first, cap, gown, diploma tube, me squinting like a man affronted by weather. Then Nora asked for one with just the two of us off to the side near a bench under a sycamore. A friend took it. I do not know yet whether I even like the picture. My face looks older than I feel and more relieved than I intended. Nora looks exactly like herself, sharp, tired, proud without performing it. Afterward, we sat on the bench for a minute because she said she needed one non-ceremonial breath before re-entering the crowd. That phrase alone told me college had done useful work on her. Then she asked, "Do you want to know the weird part?" Always. I don't think of that year first anymore. I turned and looked at her. "What year? You know which one?" She looked down at the diploma tube, turning slowly in her hands. "The hospital, Mom, Gavin, all of it. It's not the first frame anymore." I sat very still. "What is?" She shrugged. "This. High school after. May on Sundays. The new house. You learning to cook without creating a smoke event. The fights we had that were actually about now instead of then. The boring stuff." She looked at me and smiled a little. I think boring won. There it was. Better than a verdict. Better than any sentence I had wanted the law to say out loud. Boring won. Not because boring is noble, because boring is what predators try to steal first. Ordinary life. Ordinary trust. Ordinary mornings. The right to have a Tuesday that is only Tuesday. I laughed then, a real one, and she laughed too. Then she leaned her head briefly against my shoulder the way she had not done since she was maybe 11 and said, "You know what your actual revenge was? I've heard several theories." No. She sat back and pointed the diploma tube at me like a judge with bad taste. Your actual revenge was not becoming the version of yourself they needed to justify what they did. I looked at her. "That's annoyingly good." "I know," she said. "I'm expensive to educate." Later that evening, at dinner with her friends and May and Danny and two professors who clearly found our family both interesting and mildly alarming, Celeste stood to leave before dessert. She came over to the table, touched Nora's shoulder, and said she was proud of her. No extra lines, no bid for absolution, just that. Nora thanked her, no more, no less. Then Celeste turned to me. There are moments when former spouses exchange entire dissertations in one small look. This was one of them. Not love, not forgiveness, not even peace in the decorative sense. Recognition. She knew the structure she had built had failed to define the rest of our daughter's life. I knew she knew it. That was enough. No words would have improved it. After she left, May leaned toward me and said, "Now that is what a proper defeat looks like." I asked what she meant. May took a bite of cake, chewed slowly, and said, "Not prison, not settlement, not the rest. This, the child graduating from a life they did not get to author." I wrote that down later too. Graduating from a life they did not get to author. May would hate knowing how often she ended up in my notebooks. Good. That is one of the few petty pleasures age still allows me. That night, back home, Nora dropped the cap on the kitchen counter and said, "I'm starving enough to ruin all your groceries." I told her to start with the expensive cheese. She did. Then she sat on the counter in bare feet and asked whether I ever wished the whole thing had ended more violently, more publicly, more undeniably, a crash instead of an audit. I told her no, not because I am above spectacle in some holy way, because spectacle would have given them a story where emotion made everyone equal, and emotion was never equal in that fight. They planned. I corrected. That distinction mattered too much to surrender to noise. She nodded like she had expected that answer, and then said the final thing that made the whole long arc settle in me. "I think that's why I'm okay now," she said, "because you never asked me to help you hate them." I had to turn away then and pretend to inspect the refrigerator because there are some clean sentences a father should not look at directly if he intends to remain structurally intact. That was it. That was closure. Not the judge, not the board, not the sale, not the clawback. Not even the house by the water evaporating under paperwork. This, a daughter old enough to name what protected her, a father old enough to hear it without trying to decorate it. So yes, I kept the company. Yes, they lost the future they were building in my name. Yes, the paper trail strangled the fantasy cleanly. Yes, consequences reached everyone who deserved them in the proportion institutions could manage. All of that matters, but the deepest closure was smaller, more domestic, more durable. I did not pass my hunger for vengeance into the next generation disguised as moral instruction. I passed sequence, boundaries, language, suspicion of soft words doing hard work, and the belief that ordinary life is worth defending long before anyone needs a courtroom to explain why. That is the ending I trust, and unlike the one they started drafting outside my hospital room, this one stays put. One last thing about revenge before I hand this story over and let it sit where it belongs. People keep imagining revenge as a feeling. It is not. Feelings are weather. Revenge worth respecting is design under moral restraint. It is deciding what must be preserved, what must be exposed, what must be denied to the people who counted on your confusion, and what part of yourself must not be sacrificed, even if sacrifice would feel glorious for 5 minutes. I had plenty of chances to do stupid things. That matters because a man who tells a story like mine and pretends virtue came naturally is lying in a different register. I could have confronted Gavin in the garage and made it physical. I pictured it once, very clearly. Cold concrete. His surprise. My hands discovering all at once how much older fury weighs in the shoulders. I could have sent the notebook pages anonymously to every board member and let rumor do the ugliest work without process. I could have walked into the Friday dinner already exploding and given Celeste the exact emotional evidence she needed to support the fatigue narrative. I could have used Nora's pain more publicly because public pain converts fast into sympathy, and sympathy can pressure institutions quicker than accounting sometimes can. I could have humiliated them socially before the legal scaffolding was ready. I could have told clients first. I could have scorched the company just to ensure they did not inherit smoke-free assets. I did none of those things, not because I'm saintly, because each of those moves would have fed appetite at the price of authorship. They wanted me loud, confused, reactive, personal, morally self-congratulating. They wanted a version of me who could be described in board minutes as unstable in effect, even if not in formal diagnosis. They wanted a man who would mistake emotional satisfaction for strategic victory. The smartest thing I did was refuse them that version of me. Restraint is never as glamorous in retelling. Too bad. Restraint saved the case. Restraint protected Nora. Restraint kept Dr. Hale credible, Mallory usable, May steady, Ezra surgical. Restraint is what let every other competent person around me do their work without having to step around my ego. There was one night, months after the first collapse, when I sat alone on the back steps of the new house with a drink I did not particularly want, and finally admitted to myself what kind of revenge would actually have satisfied the darkest part of me. Not prison, not debt, not the loss of the Annapolis property, not even public disgrace. What that darkest part wanted was for Celeste and Gavin to feel, for 10 uninterrupted minutes, exactly what it was like to wake up inside a room where the future had already been discussed without your permission. That is impossible, of course. Pain does not transfer cleanly. People who exploit you rarely experience your wound in reverse. At best, they experience consequence, which is colder and often morally smaller than the hurt they caused. That realization matters. It keeps revenge from metastasizing into fantasy. Fantasy wastes good years. So I settled for something harder and more adult. I made them live in a world where their preferred version of events no longer organized the room. That is the most complete defeat certain people can suffer. Not suffering, displacement, losing control over meaning. Having the board, the court, the company, the child, the doctors, the neighbors, the old women, the accountants, all stop using your language and start using another one. Not concern, strategy, not continuity, transfer, not support, unauthorized access, not family stress, domestic narrative management, not love, appetite. That is how you end predators built more from self-interpretation than from force. You do not merely punish them, you rename them in public systems they do not control. If I sound proud of that, good. I am. Not proud that my marriage failed. Not proud that my daughter had to grow precision where a simpler childhood should have been. Not proud that my brother chose resentment as a career. Proud that when the soft knives came out, I did not hand them my throat just because we shared blood and furniture. Proud that I learned fast enough. Proud that I let evidence replace injury without allowing injury to disappear. Proud that I stopped confusing decency with silence and control with cruelty. Years later, when the whole thing no longer wakes me at 3 a.m. but still occasionally sits beside me at dawn like an uninvited teacher who nonetheless earned the chair, this is the formula I keep. If they want your money, trace it. If they want your role, freeze it. If they want your child, stand between. If they want your weakness, define it yourself before they do. If they want your silence, make them speak first. Then let the record carry what rage no longer needs to. That is not a slogan. It is a blueprint paid for in hospital light, family rot, legal fees, and the long humiliating education of realizing how much can be taken from a man who still believes love automatically disinfects motive. Maybe somebody else can use it cheaper than I learned it. that would be enough. And yes, for the sake of total honesty, there are days when I still enjoy imagining the exact second the thing broke for them. The moment Celeste heard May's name and realized the chair they wanted had already moved. The moment Gavin understood the recorder had been running. The moment the judge asked when concern became integrated with authority transfer. The moment Nora refused the role of witness they drafted and became instead the person who ended their household fiction cleanly. The moment they saw, all at once, that the quiet they had mistaken for weakness was actually the floor dropping out from under their future. Those moments are not my life now, but I do not deny enjoying them. Why should I? Pleasure in justice is not the same thing as addiction to harm. Too many people confuse those on purpose because they want the betrayed forever humble, forever gracious, forever educational in their suffering. No, I was exact, I was patient. And when the time came, I was satisfied. That is allowed. Now the story is complete. Not because every wound vanished, because every line returned to the right owner. My body to me, my company to law instead of appetite, my daughter to her own voice, my brother to the consequences of his choices, my wife to the architecture she built and could not keep standing, and my name to the ending they once thought they could draft around me while I still sounded weak in a hospital bed. That is the revenge. That is the closure. That is the whole thing. That, more than the settlement or the board vote or the mediated signatures, is probably the real ending. Not that I kept the company. Not that Celeste lost the house she wanted. Not that Gavin never became what he imagined himself becoming. Not even that the fraud was exposed. The real ending is this. My daughter learned, before too many years had gone by, that adults can betray you through procedure just as brutally as they can through violence. And she also learned something better at the same time. That quiet men are not always passive. That precision can beat performance. That truth does not become weak just because it arrives in a low voice. I died for 92 seconds on a Friday morning. They thought that gave them the right to stage my exit. Instead, it forced me to sit still long enough to see who had already started rehearsing without me. That was their mistake. And it was the last one I ever let them make in my name.